Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Edelstein, and I'm the Vice President for Education here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome all of you here for today's seminar, which is entitled Jewish Cultural Resistance in Vilna. Dr. Paul Radensky, our Assistant Director for Education, arranged today's seminar. He couldn't be here today, but he asked me to share some thoughts with you about how our theme came about. I wanted to tell you, though, he didn't write it in the notes, but for those of you who know Paul, it's always nice to share good news. He couldn't be here today because he's at his youngest daughter's graduation from high school, the last one. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, so it's a good reason to not be here. And he looks forward to seeing the video. Okay, so now I'm going to share Paul's remarks. Imagine me with a beard. Okay. As you may know, we have a wonderful exhibition upstairs called Memory Unearthed, the Lodz Ghetto Photographs of Henrik Ross. Memory Unearthed is a very powerful and moving exhibition. May I ask, is there anyone here who has not seen it yet? Okay, I strongly encourage you to go see it upstairs. And an important part of the story, Henrik Ross's work, was that before the Lodz Ghetto was liquidated, Ross buried his negatives in metal boxes, and Ross and his wife were among the 800 or so Jews who remained in the ghetto and were not deported. Water had infiltrated some of the metal boxes, so about half of the negatives were damaged or ruined, but about half survived. So the photographs that survived, even with the damage, are shown upstairs. The story of Ross's negatives shares much in common with other heroic Jewish efforts to document what was happening during the war, and also to save as much Jewish material culture as possible. One well-known case, of course, is the Oneg Shabbos archive, created by Emanuel Ringelblum and others. Today, we'll look at another example of Jewish cultural resistance, the efforts of the Yiddish writers and scholars in Vilna. We'll explore what made Vilna unique in the interwar period and what it went through during the war. We will examine, he wrote something funny. We will examine the efforts of some of the Jews of Vilna to save Jewish culture, and finally, we'll delve into one of the most important attempts to remember Vilna. Oh no, he does this so beautifully, and I'm going to butcher it. And Irve'em beYisrael. Thank you. Okay, good. Good, okay. Or in English, a mother city in Israel. I'd like to take a moment, now remember, I'm still Paul. I'd like to take a moment to thank Professor Fishman, who in addition to being my doctoral advisor, will speak today. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany for funding today's programs and so many of the today's program and so many of the education programs at the museum. So those of you who came in late, I'll collect tickets, but I do have programs outside, but I'll go through the program right now briefly. First, we'll hear from Dr. Fishman, an overview of pre-war Jewish Vilna and of Vilna Jewry under Nazi occupation. After a short break, Dr. Fishman will present on his book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis. Following a second short break, we'll hear from Justin Cammy, professor at Smith College, on Avrom Sutzkever's memoir of the Vilna Ghetto, 1945. So I have to take care of some housekeeping issues. May I ask everybody to silence their telephone, please? Thank you. If you're a teacher in a Jewish school and you did not sign the sheet outside the front door, please stop by in one of the breaks and we'll do that. In addition, I've given everybody evaluation forms. So I've given it to everybody, and everybody's welcome to complete it. it is especially important that I get the completed form from the teachers who participate today, since this information goes to our generous funder, the Claims Conference. So thank you for taking that task seriously. I'm going to give a brief advertisement for our upcoming stage seminar in July. It will take place July 16th through 19th, and the topic will be New Perspectives on America and the Holocaust. This seminar is designated for teachers only. I'm sorry to the general public who's here, and admission is by application. If you're a teacher in a Jewish school and you would like to apply, please see me at the end of today's seminar or on one of the breaks. I do have the application form so that I can give you one. So in addition to keeping your cell phone off, I request that we refrain from side conversations during the presentations. And for those of you who don't know the museum, the lobby, the restrooms are, you go to the lobby, right and right. And it's now time to introduce the first speaker, Professor David Fishman. David Fishman is professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, teaching courses in modern Jewish history. Dr. Fishman also serves as director of Project Judaica, JTS's program in the former Soviet Union. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and authors on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His most recent book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, published by Forage in 2017, has been hailed as monuments men for book lovers and first-rate scholarship that pulses with the beat of a most human heart. I know so many of you stopped by the sign-in desk as you arrived and said how wonderful it was to read this book, so I join you in looking forward to Professor Fishman's talks. It was, The Book Smugglers was the 2017 National Jewish Book Award in the category of Holocaust. Later, we'll hear from Professor Justin Cammy, who is a literary and cultural historian with research and teaching interests in Yiddish literature. His publications range from essays on canonical Yiddish writers to scholarly translations of Yiddish literature to critical introductions to new editions of works by Yiddish writers and memoirists. He's in the final stage of completing a book on Young Vilna, the last Yiddish literary group in interwar Poland, and an English edition of Abraham's, now, thank you, Sutzkever. I've heard it both ways, and it always sounds better to me, Sutzkever also. Okay. Avrom Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto, one of the earliest Yiddish Holocaust memoirs to describe the destruction of a Jewish city. Please help me welcome Professor David Fishman.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a great institution, and it's wonderful to visit. I've decided to divide my topics a little bit differently than previously planned. I'm going to, in the first talk, really talk about Vilna as a Jewish city before the war, its traditions and its history and its special character. And then the second talk will both cover the book smugglers, the rescue of cultural treasures, and more generally, as background, the Vilna Ghetto and the history of the Vilna Ghetto. And of course, there's always time for questions. You can raise your hand even in the middle of my talking, but I will definitely leave 10, 15 minutes at the end of each talk just for questions and discussions. So we've got an hour session, and I'm only talking for no more than 45 minutes so that, you know, you can participate with comments, observations, or questions. Here goes. The city Vilna, on this map, let me see if I can, no, I can't show you. Okay. Warsaw, there. Eastern Europe's a complicated part of the world. Borders always shifted. In fact, there's even a joke about Vilna. someone saying, I grew up in Russia, I went to elementary school in Germany, I went to high school in Poland, I now live in the Soviet Union, and I never left Vilna. In other words, you didn't have to go to other countries, the other countries came to you. For the 19th century, this city belonged to Russia, Tsarist Russia. After World War I, it belonged to Poland. Jews typically did not call it Russia and did not call it Poland. They called it Lithuania, Lita. That whole northern section there was Lita. On the eve of the Holocaust, just to give you a baseline, the city had only, what sounds small to us, 70,000 Jews, but those 70,000 Jews were about a third of the total population of the city. That's a pretty high proportion, right? New York, which feels very Jewish, estimates are like 15% Jewish. Here we're talking about a third. This is the city, a map of the city. Vilna, or as Lithuanians today call it, Vilnius, dates back to the 1300s. The city was founded in the 1300s. And Jews first appeared there in the 1500s, 200 years later. This is the great cathedral of the central cathedral of Vilna, established, at least by tradition, in 1386. And strikingly, on the cathedral, there are pictures of different Christian saints, but not very typically, there is a statue of Moses right near the entrance to the cathedral. And Jews even developed a whole legend about why Moses would be on the front of the city cathedral. Well, the original cathedral, according to tradition, not this building, was 1386. There was a cathedral here beginning, or a Christian church there beginning in 1386. No, Lithuanians and Poles are Lithuanians, like Poles, are Catholics. This is a Catholic church. This is a Catholic part of the world. Even though it belonged to Russia, there weren't many Russians in this city, even under Russian rule, right? This is pretty much a Polish Jewish city, okay? 40% Jewish, or a third Jewish, a little more than a third Polish, and a little less than a third all the rest, whether they happen to be ethnic Lithuanians, Russians, Germans, etc. And this is the old Jewish, famous street, Yatkevergas, the Butcher Street, on the old Jewish quarter of Vilna, sometimes referred to the ghetto, though it wasn't technically a ghetto. Technically a ghetto in Jewish history, before the Holocaust, means it must have a gate, which is opened and closed, and Jews can work outside the ghetto during daytime, but they must get in before the gate is closed. There's a curfew. Technically, Vilna didn't have that kind of ghetto, did not have a gate, but it had an old Jewish quarter, and this arch at the street on the top of Yatkever, the two arches actually, that became the kind of iconic image of Jewish Vilna. In other words, if Jews thought about something architectural or visual, when they thought of Vilna, they thought of these arches. You can see that in this next image. This is, I know it's small for you, but these are the logos of many local Jewish organizations. All of them have in them the image of that arch. Here is a theater with the arch, a newspaper, a publishing house, the literary group Vilna, a library. So it's sort of like, the arch has become the logo of the Jewish community. Right, this is the heart of Jewish Vilna. It is the Schulhof, the Synagogue Courtyard. It's a complex of buildings, not one building, but many buildings. In fact, there are 12 houses of prayer in this. Lithuanian Jews use not the word usually besmedrash, but usually the word klois. 12 kloisen in here, different prayer houses. Of course, the big building toward the right is the Great Synagogue, in Yiddish called the Stotzschul, built in 1572. It may not look enormous, but when you entered it, you went down a flight of steps underground. So then when you got to the bottom and looked up, it actually looked very high. Across from it, to the left, is the house and the synagogue, house of prayer, of the Vilna Gaon, Vilna's most famous rabbi. I'll talk about him immediately in a minute. And in front of the Great Synagogue, a newer building, the community library, known as the Strashun Bibliothek, the Strashun Jewish Community Library of Vilna, and inside many other institutions. Again, this emerged, this Schulhof, in the 1500s. It remains the heart of old Jewish Vilna, certainly till the turn of the 20th century. Was the most common Jewish tourist attraction. If you visited Vilna, you wanted to go see the Stotzschul and the Schulhof. This is the interior of the Great Synagogue. And this is that famous rabbi I mentioned, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbeinu Eliyahu, Elijah, the son of Solomon Zalman. He lived from 1720 to 1797. And he's sort of like the man who created the ethos of Vilna Jewry and of Lithuanian Jewry, which is a holy life is a life devoted to study of the holy books. Not so much, I'll be honest with you, that was his view of holiness. Not so much that prayer is central to holiness, not so much that good deeds are central to holiness, though he definitely affirmed both of those, but the greatest thing as far as a life of holiness is study of the great books. He studied, not 24 hours a day, but according to the stories by his sons and his students, he slept very little. In fact, he slept 3 or 4 hours and stayed locked up in his room studying books. He had a small circle of students. He did not lecture publicly. There was limited access to the man. And in fact, very important point to mention, he was not the rabbi of the Jewish community of Vilna. There was somebody else who was the community rabbi, the rabbi who went to meetings, who officiated at weddings, who took care of kashrut, all those kind of functions. The Vilna Gaon was not the rabbi of Vilna. He was a private scholar, and he didn't want to be the rabbi of Vilna because it would have taken a lot of time away from his devotion to study. So he's a kind of hermit. And I won't go on about him, but I do want to say that the tradition of intellectualism that Lithuanian Jewry develops, the importance of reading, the importance of study, the importance of ideas, is really a tradition that begins with the Vilna Gaon, though it goes through many metamorphoses. In other words, later stages of Jewish thought and culture in Lithuania won't be pious, but they'll always be very intellectual, whether it's the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, whether it's the Zionist movement. The centrality of literature and of books and of thinking remains even as Jews change. Right, this is an edition of a volume of the Talmud published in Vilna, the classical edition of the Talmud, used by Jews all across the world in the 19th century and the early 20th century, was the Vilna Shas, the Vilna edition of the Talmud. There were 3 Vilna Shases in the 19th century. I know this is hard for us to remember since we live in the days of the internet. But once upon a time, printing was really with lead plates, and the Talmud is a very complicated publishing project because there are all these commentaries on the page. You need big letters, small letters, different typefaces, and a lot of volumes. So there aren't a lot of editions of the full set of the Talmud with all those commentaries. Vilna did it 3 times in the 19th century. Yes, Lithuanian Jews, Vilna getting I should have mentioned this at the very beginning. Of course, Vilna is called Yerushalayim de Lita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. It's a very special and unusual name. We don't have a lot of communities in Jewish history that get called Jerusalem. There are a couple in Spain and Germany and Poland, but they're all very unusual when they get that nickname, the Jerusalem of Ashkenaz, the Jerusalem of Sfarad, the Jerusalem of Poland. Vilna is called already in the 1600s the Jerusalem of Lithuania. The Jews there are called Litvaks, right? You may have heard Litvaks and Galicianers as contrasting each other. Litvaks are typically, yes, intellectual, and they're also not Hasidic. They are misnagdim. They're opponents of the Hasidic movement, or at least they're non-Hasidic. And that's a tradition begun by the Vilna Gaon. Rabbi Elijah of Vilna excommunicated the Hasidim several times in the late 1700s. He was the driving force. He believed actually the Hasidic movement was heretical. And generally speaking, he failed. In other words, Hasidism grew, Hasidism flourished, Hasidism was accepted as a version of Judaism. But in Vilna itself and in its immediate vicinity, he basically won. In other words, there are very few Hasidim in Vilna. This is largely a non-Hasidic, even the ultra-Orthodox there are non-Hasidim, they're misnagdim. Right, this is simply the greatest yeshiva in Vilna itself was the Ramailis Yeshiva. This is the identity card of a student who attended the Ramailis Yeshiva. This, I think I will only briefly say, is to remind us of, there are two great founding figures of Jewish Vilna. One is the Vilna Gaon, and the other is the person known as the Ger Tzedek, the righteous convert, Count Valentin Potocki. Potocki was, as you may know from the name, a scion, a child of a famous Polish aristocratic family. Polish aristocrats who owned enormous estates, tremendous wealth. But this son of those Polish aristocrats started traveling across Europe and encountered Jews, and in Amsterdam converted to Judaism. This is about the time of the Vilna Gaon in the 1740s and 50s. He converted to Judaism, returned back to Vilna, to Lithuania, but at that time conversion to Judaism in Poland, Lithuania was illegal. So he had to hide the fact that he was a convert, that he was Count Valentin Potocki, and he tried to pass himself off as just another Jew. But somehow word got out that that's not just any Jew, that's Count Valentin Potocki. He was arrested, he was seized, he was given the choice either to return to Christianity or to be burnt at the stake. Count Valentin Potocki, the story goes, was burnt at the stake on Shavuos, on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, in 1759. His ashes were gathered by Jews, buried at the Jewish cemetery, and a great tree grew up on the site of his grave. So he's kind of the great martyr, the founding martyr of Vilna Jewry is this convert, Valentin Potocki, from the 1700s. And of course, his grave becomes a big shrine at the Jewish cemetery, old Jewish cemetery. Okay, moving on. Jews change. In Vilna, I started with the traditional, the rabbinic, the Talmudic Jewish Vilna, but Jews change. Here is a picture of the greatest Hebrew poet of the 19th century, Yehuda Leib Gordon, Judah Leib Gordon. And yes, he does have a trimmed beard, but he's not covering his head. This is a different kind of Jew. He's one of the leaders of the Haskalah movement, of the Enlightenment movement, the Jewish Enlightenment movement in Vilna. Gordon was a great opponent of the Litvak rabbis. He thought they were closed-minded, backward, limited, legalistic, rigid, and he attacked all those characteristics in Hebrew verse, in biblical Hebrew. He knew biblical Hebrew better than the rabbis, and he used the language to polemicize against the old culture. His greatest poem, longest poem, is called On the Tip of the Letter Yud, called Social Yud. it tells the story of a woman who got divorced. Her husband issued her a get, a ritual divorce. His name was Binyamin. He then left town. We don't know what happened to Binyamin, actually. Disappeared. And then she wants to get remarried. The rabbis look at her writ of divorce, and they see that the letter Yud is missing in the name Binyamin. What? Wasn't the name Hillel? Oh, I'm sorry, Hillel, right. And they say there's the letter Yud is missing, and because of that, the get is no longer, the writ of divorce is not valid. She is still married. She cannot remarry. She is still married to this guy who we can't find. And it's in other words, it's a poem. The broad strokes of it are, number one, the plight of the Jewish woman under traditional Judaism. And number two, the cold callousness of the rabbi who doesn't understand that through a technicality, he is ruining the life of this woman. All right, I wanted to go through that so you get a sense of what the Haskalah is. It is a rebellious movement against traditional Judaism, calling for changes. The Haskalah flourishes in Vilna. Vilna is one of its greatest centers. There they publish a modern Hebrew newspaper, HaKarmel. And there the Maskilim, the followers of this Jewish Enlightenment, create their own synagogue, a synagogue with a choir, right? That's a modern innovation. A synagogue with a sermon, either in German or later in Russian. In other words, all these are signs of change and modernity. And this Choral Synagogue, which, by the way, is the only synagogue that still stands and is used as a synagogue in Vilnius today, right, it becomes the center of, again, the more modernized and usually the better off Jews in Vilna. So don't confuse this synagogue with the Great Synagogue that I showed you before. The Great Synagogue is ancient, 1500s, in the old Jewish quarter. The Choral Synagogue is new, founded in the 1840s by these followers of the Enlightenment. You can see the leadership of the synagogue, top hats, tuxedos, formal attire. We can discuss that, but I would not call it reform. We could discuss that later, but I will simply say, if reform means cutting parts out of the liturgy or changing the language of prayer, this is not reform. It introduces certain changes, but it's definitely not reform by that criteria. But it is clearly these are modern people. Their language for sermons is either German or Russian, and they're making a statement about not being the old-fashioned kind of Jew. And one other new institution, I mentioned it briefly before, the Jewish Community Library. This is not a Beit Midrash, this is not a house of Talmudic study, this is a library with all kinds of books. I'll come back to the Strasbourg Library later, I think in my second talk. I just wanted to get something across about religious Zionism in Vilna. Vilna becomes, at the turn of the 20th century, a great center of the Zionist movement in Eastern Europe. The religious Zionist movement, Mizrahi, that was its name, was founded in Vilna at a conference in Vilna in 1902. I like this because this is a flag for Simchas Torah, right, where kids run around with flags. But inside the flag are not verses about the Torah, but is the text of Hatikva, which is at that time the anthem of the Zionist movement. This flag was printed in Vilna. Theodor Herzl made one visit to the Russian Empire in his life. In 1903, he only stopped off in two cities. In St. Petersburg, the capital, where he had negotiations with the Tsarist officials. Not very successful ones, but he did meet with the Minister of Interior of the Russian Empire. And on the way back from St. Petersburg, he stopped off in one place, namely in Vilna. Again, to show you the prestige of this community. If there was one place to stop off, In the whole Russian Empire, on the way back to St. Petersburg, it was the Jerusalem of Lithuania, it was Vilna. So the man in the carriage, sitting in the carriage, is Theodor Herzl. Yes, Vilna is part of the Russian Empire until World War I. That is until 1914, 1915. Vilna is part of the Russian Empire. From 1793 until 1914, Vilna belongs to the Russian Empire. Also very important in Vilna is the Jewish Socialist movement. The movement of Jews who are fighting for a revolution in Russia. Their solution to the Jewish problem is not that Jews will leave, not that Jews will build the homeland somewhere else, but that Jews have to fight to change the nature of the country where they live. And that means to bring down the regime of a czar and to create a better Russia, a Russia of equality, a socialist Russia. In Vilna, there was a distinctly Jewish socialist movement founded in the same year as the World Zionist movement, 1897, called the Bund. Bund means alliance in Yiddish. The full name was der Allgemeine Jiddischer Arbeiterbund von Russland, Litte und Polen, the General Jewish Workers Alliance of Russia, Lithuania, and Poland. It's founded in the attic of that building on that house on the left in Vilna. Why in the attic? Because socialist movements were illegal. The socialist movements were underground. After all, they're plotting to overthrow the regime through a revolution. So they couldn't meet in a fancy Congress hall like the Zionists did in Basel, Switzerland. Instead, they meet in the attic of a house in a corner, rather neglected corner of the city. And here on the right is the greatest hero and martyr in the history of the Bund, Hirsch Leckert. Leckert, I need to tell you the story. On May 1st, 1902, the Bund organizes a major demonstration on the streets of Vilna, non-sanctioned. May 1st, the workers' holiday. Red banners, Yiddish letters on those banners, down with autocracy, long live socialism, equality, freedom. The police and Cossacks, attack the demonstrators, beat many of them, and arrest many of them. And then they do something that hadn't typically been done. Instead of, sending these people to Siberia for several years, they arrange a public beating of the arrested, flogging of the arrested demonstrators, almost all of them Jewish demonstrators, right? That is a whipping in public. This, of course, aroused the tremendous fury and anger of members of the Bund who said, if they had been Polish demonstrators or Russian demonstrators, they wouldn't have been treated like dogs. But because they were Jews, they were treated this way. So the anger in the Bund rises, and Hirsch Leckert is the man who took some action. He got a gun, and he decided to try to assassinate the governor general of the Vilna province, von Wahl. He went to the circus. We knew that the governor was going to a circus. When the governor came out of a circus, he shot at him. He wounded the governor, but he did not kill him. And Hirsch Leckert was immediately arrested, immediately hanged. And he's the martyr, the great hero and martyr in the history of the Bund. I want to repeat, he was a simpler shoemaker, illiterate shoemaker. And it was not common in 1902 when this happened for Jews to take a gun on behalf of the honor or dignity of fellow Jews. Later things like the Haganah did not yet exist. And it's a great event remembered by all who of that generation, Hirsch Leckert. And again, what I wanted to get across from you is the Bund was both founded in Vilna, and probably its most famous historical incident happened on the streets of Vilna. This is Bundist literature, most of it illegal. Okay, now we have to move on. World War I. I'll make a long story short. Vilna changed hands 8 times during World War I, from the Russians to the Germans to the Lithuanians to the Poles to the Lithuanians to the Poles to the Soviets to the Poles. When the dust settled, Vilna belonged to Poland. Jews had not really wanted that, but that's the way it ended up. So now Vilna is a city in the far northeastern corner of the Polish state. And economically, it declines because it's stuck near the border with 2 countries. Poland has no ties with, no economic relations with the Soviet Union and independent Lithuania. But it continues, and it's now, I'll just make it clear, in interwar Poland, the 4th largest Jewish community in Poland. There's Warsaw, the capital, 350,000 Jews. There's Łódź, big industrial city, with 150,000 Jews. There's Lemberg, or Lwów in Galicia, with 100,000 Jews. And Vilna's number 4. What is extraordinary is even though it's number 4, it's not even one of the top 3. It remains culturally a very important center, rivaling Warsaw. In other words, in the interwar period, there are always these discussions by intellectuals, which place is better? Which place is stronger and richer? Is it Vilna or is it Warsaw? The 70,000 Jews in Vilna or the 350,000 in Warsaw? Yes, Polish anti-Semitism is fierce in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. This is just a election poster from a far-right Polish party saying, you know, if you don't want Jews to take over this city, if you don't want to be a slave to Jews, vote for us, you know, the Catholic People's Party. I would say Polish anti-Semitism was more fierce in Vilna than in Warsaw, precisely because it's on the border, disputed territory, and the Poles wanted to assert, this is ours, nobody else's. And because of that, the community is very much focused on itself. They have to build institutions of their own. They've done that earlier, but especially in the interwar period, that's important. The Jewish hospital is important for Jews because they're not sure what kind of treatment they'll get in other hospitals in the city. And Jewish social service agencies are important because you can't count on the municipal government to treat Jews fairly. And culturally, therefore, Jews also are working based on their own resources. And you get a remarkable cultural flourish of modern Jewish culture and communal activity. I started with this one only because it's first, chronologically, Yiddish theater. Vilna is the place where the first modern dramatic Yiddish theater was founded, the Vilna Truppe in 1915. What I mean by that is, till then, Yiddish theater had always been musical comedy. Yiddish theater was initially musical and comic. And then the first serious Yiddish theater troupe, which wanted to do drama of different types, was this Vilna Truppe, which performed, for instance, the play The Dybbuk by Ansky, right? If you know of it, again, a serious story set in a shtetl. In Vilna, between the 2 world wars, more than anywhere else, Yiddish remains strong. In other words, whereas in Warsaw, Jews quickly in the 1920s and 30s acquire the Polish language, in Vilna, they stay strongly attached to the Yiddish language. And these are books published by the Ort Technicum. There was a Jewish technical college in Vilna to teach people how to become engineers, Jews how to become engineers. But what's amazing about the Ort Technicum, technical college in Vilna, is the language of instruction was Yiddish. And that meant teaching chemistry in Yiddish and physics in Yiddish, and electronics in Yiddish. And these are just some of those textbooks published in Yiddish in the Vilna Ort Technicum. This is a modern community. You're seeing, this is, for instance, a magazine about public health. In other words, about diet, sanitation, and in general about health issues. Folks, because it was published in Vilna in the 1930s. This issue is devoted to how to avoid tuberculosis. My basic point is, in the 20s and 30s, this is a very modern Jewish community. This is not the Vilna of the Vilna Gaon anymore. So we get here, for instance, the Jewish Women's Association of Vilna, a women's organization that had professional courses and professional school for women, so that women can have jobs, can make a living on their own. The Women's Association's also dealing with, had a shelter for homeless women, for battered women. It also had a department to deal with problem of prostitution, because you do have prostitution, including Jewish prostitution in Vilna in the 1920s and 30s, just as you do in every big city, there will be prostitution. So it's a very active and a very different kind of organization than you would have had earlier. This is the main Jewish sports organization, Maccabi Vilna. There were several Jewish sports organizations in Vilna, usually divided along political lines. Different political parties had their own sports organizations. It's a very important phenomenon because it's, in a way, it's a break with the intellectualism of Vilna, because it's saying, these movements all said, it's great to deal with the Jewish mind and the Jewish spirit, but we can't forget the Jewish body. And that means, you know, Jews should be engaged in sports, whether it's basketball or gymnastics or soccer. Jews have to be physically fit. And all the new Jewish movements, whether they're socialist or Zionist, embrace that ideal that Jews have focused in the past too much on the mind and on the spirit, and now have to shift the balance and focus on the body. I'll come back to this. This is, nonetheless, and even the intellectual trends, let me put it that way, even the intellectual trends that you see in the new Vilna between the two world wars are different than the old ones, markedly so. This is the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, founded in Vilna in 1925. It's a international institution for the study of Jewish literature, history, folklore, economics, using the methods of the social sciences, the latest methods of the humanities and social sciences to study Jewish affairs. Interestingly, this YIVO had branches in Berlin and in New York, but its headquarters was Vilna. Yes, Jews had a different geography. New York is a new offshoot of Jewish life in 1925. Berlin, though a great intellectual center of European culture, is from a Jewish perspective the provinces. The center is Vilna. You can see courses and reading room. I'll talk more about YIVO in the second talk. And you have, and here I'm not going to say much because Justin Cammy is the world's expert, the new Yiddish literary group that appears in Vilna, Jung Vilna, which the group arose in 1928 or 1929. They're all poets, storytellers, also some plastic artists. So Jewish creativity continues, but it's not the creativity of the Vilna Gaon. It's not the creativity of Yehuda Leib Gordon, because mainly the creativity is in Yiddish and not in Hebrew anymore. And it is, it's not dealing with the same problems that the Haskalah dealt with in the 19th century. This is an issue of their magazine, Jung Vilna. And again, you can see on the lower right-hand corner the arches of Yad Kevergas that we saw at the beginning of this talk, right? The old Jewish quarter, the old Jewish ghetto. And then smokestack of a factory and the sun rising. And what you have to think of is the Jewish eye moving from right to left, since Hebrew and Yiddish are from right to left. So you start with the old ghetto and you move up and to the new world, right? Young Vilna meaning actually the young and the new and the old. Young and old. Vilna means by nature old. Finally, I know you can't go through this table, but I want to make this a little more concrete. If I had the time, if we were in a course, I'd analyze the table. This is about school attendance in 1929 in Vilna. Where did Jewish kids go to school? What's striking about it is something like 15% of Jewish children in Vilna went to public school. That is 85% went to Jewish schools of different types. Even though they cost tuition, only 15%, and public schools are free. Of those, the remaining 85%, though, the majority are going to modern Jewish schools of different types. They're either going to modern Yiddish language schools, which are usually socialist oriented, left of center. They're going to modern Yiddish schools, or they're going to modern Hebrew language schools, which are Zionist, but not religious in any particular way. They celebrate Jewish holidays, but they celebrate it the way, I guess, people in Israel do. That is, as national holidays, not by going to synagogue or by praying. So a majority of Jewish kids are going to modern Jewish schools of either the Yiddish or the Hebrew variety. Yes, religious Zionist schools are quite strong. 20% of Jewish kids go to religious Zionist schools. As far as the traditional Orthodox schools, non-Zionist, like the Cheder and that, only 10% of Jewish kids are going to that kind of, truly, fully traditional Jewish school. So what I just told you, to sum that up, is the two ends of the spectrum are weak. That is, public school education and strictly Orthodox education are the smallest types of education for Jewish kids. What's strong is the middle. That is modern schools, but under Jewish auspices, whether socialist, Zionist, or religious Zionist. Finally, again, I wanted to mention the community develops a very strong pride and self-consciousness. They're very proud that they are the community of the Vilna Gaon, the community that founded the Bund. So much so, maybe the best expression of their local pride is a song is written that becomes the community anthem, right? Not a lot of communities have basically songs that become unofficial anthems. This is the song Vilna, which was sung, it actually was written in America, but migrates back to Vilna, and it's sung at public cultural events. It will be sung in the Vilna Ghetto, and its first line is Vilna Stadt von Geist und Mimes. Vilna, a city of spirit and of simplicity, right? And then the second line is Vilna Jiddischlich vertracht. Vilna is a city sort of immersed in Jewish thoughts. So I guess what you're getting even in the first few lines is the idea of it's a very Jewish city, a very spiritual and thoughtful city. And the refrain is Vilna, Vilna, unser Heimstatt. Vilna, our home city. Jews loved this city. They were not alienated from it, even with all the tensions with the Polish population. They loved its landmarks, its streets, and very much felt a part of the city landscape. And in many ways, they were still Yerushalayim Delita on the eve of World War II. Thank you. I've left time so we can have questions and discussion.
We're going to do questions using cards.
Oh,
So,
cards, written
yes,
questions.
We are. Yes, we are.
Okay, so we're not going to have no counter lectures. Okay.
Pencils, here they are.
Okay, then I'll give you a minute. I'm okay with that. Shh. Let's keep it. I'm going to take quick factual questions, okay?
Was there a height limit? Why did they dig down the synagogue? Was there a ruling about the maximum?
Okay, why was keep writing your questions. Why would they dig down? Yes, you guessed, the synagogue is a story underground. Yes, like in all of Poland and Lithuania, and indeed in most of medieval Europe, there was a law that the synagogue could not be higher than any nearby church. So therefore, you couldn't make a high synagogue. That was against the law. And the only way to create a sense of height and depth was therefore to dig down. That's right.
Who supported the Vilna Ghetto? Was the
Could you please write your questions?
Okay. Okay.
Everybody write.
Okay, write your questions.
Happy to collect them. Thank you. I know there are more, but I'm going to give this to the professor.
Okay, boy. Okay, well, lots of questions here. Here we go. Oh, my God. Give me a second. I am quickly... All right, here we go. Why? I'm trying to organize it in a logical sequence. Why did Jews originally come to Vilna? Short answer, well, one way to put it is Jewish migration to and in Eastern Europe is through the centuries of going further and further east. So Jews arrive in Poland around the 10th century, and Vilna, which is much further east than, let's say, Krakow or Warsaw, they only reach there in the 1500s. Most places they come for economic opportunity. That's also true in Vilna. There were opportunities in Lithuania, and they got permission. Most important is to get royal permission, which they got in the 1500s. Was the Vilna Gaon wealthy? How was Yalag educated? Okay. No, the Vilna Gaon was not wealthy, and since he was something of a hermit, he didn't care about material things. But the community did support him. He got a stipend from the community. His needs were taken care of. But he lives in very modest conditions because he really thought the material is secondary to the intellectual. Judah Leib Gordon, Yalag, how was he educated? Where was he educated? Well, you know, I gave you a whirlwind tour. I couldn't mention everything. But one of the institutions of the Haskalah in Vilna was a modern rabbinical seminary, actually sponsored with government money. The idea was to create modern rabbis. That project did not achieve its goal, but a lot of young men got a modern education in that modern rabbinical seminary, and one of them was Judah Leib Gordon, who went to the... So most members of the Haskalah, however, were self-taught. Most members of the Haskalah, they read Hebrew, they picked up German, and between those two languages, they acquired whatever secular learning they could acquire. Who decided to kill the convert? Was it secular or religious government? Both. In other words, it was a law. It was, of course, the church that was most interested in retaining this situation, that conversion to Judaism was illegal in the 18th century in Poland, but it was implemented by the secular authorities. What did most people make? How did most people make a living? Like in most places in Eastern Europe, Jews tended to be mainly in trade and in the crafts. A lot of small trade, that is little stores, little shops, stands, and some larger trade. In the 19th century, there is larger trade. That is, Vilna is a good way station between, let's say, St. Petersburg and on to Warsaw or on to Königsberg. So it's an important, in the 19th century, you can have major trade going through Vilna. A lot of Jews in crafts. A lot of Jews being tailors, shoemakers, tanners, blacksmiths, a lot of wage earners. That's why the Bund was founded there, because you got a lot of workers working in shops or small factories, a lot of poor wage earners. Basically, you do have a small class of professionals, that is doctors, lawyers, but they're pretty exceptional. The big majority are either in commerce or in crafts. Could you elaborate more on Strashun? I found your book fascinating. Great, thank you. But need more information on Strashun. Well, depends if you mean the person Strashun or the library Strashun. Who wrote this question? The person Strashun. Matityahu Strashun was the library was named after him because it was based on his personal library. He was a great collector, and when he died, he donated his personal library to the community, and that's why from then on it was called the Strashun Library. He's a very interesting figure. His father was a great Talmudist, and his father's notes are in the Vilna Shas, the Rashash, Shimon Strashun. He is a bridge figure. He's a Talmudist, he's a maskil, he's a wealthy man. And the wealthy man matters because he had a lot of excess money that he used to collect rare books, Matityahu Strashun. He had, and he became a kind of collector of the 19th and even 20th century model. Someone who has money and wants to have, most people do it with art, right? That is, you want to have rare paintings. You want to have, if you're really wealthy, you'd like to have a Picasso on your wall that you can show your friends. Well, Jews in the 19th century didn't collect art, at least not in Vilna, but they collect books. And he collected, old Jewish books. And in fact, before the Strashun Library was established, everybody knew throughout Europe that this guy, Strashun, in Vilna has great collection. People would travel from far away to his home, basically sit in his dining room on the table to examine these rare books. So he's an interesting figure and a mixture of different features, both very traditional, but in some ways already modern. What about great yeshivas of Vilna in the 20th century? There's only one great yeshiva in Vilna itself in the 20th century, and that's the Ramailis Yeshiva. I showed you the ID card of a student. There are many great Lithuanian yeshivas in other places in the region, mainly in small towns. Yeshivas tended to be in small shtetl where there was less modernity, especially, you're not going to have a university, an opera, a theater, lots of Gentiles, all the bad things that traditional Orthodoxy wanted to avoid. So the great Lithuanian yeshivas are in shtetl, like Volozhin, like Mir, Navaradok, we can go on and on. There are many of them. But as far as yeshivas in Vilna, there's a small Lubavitch yeshiva in Vilna, but much smaller than the Ramailis yeshiva. How does Kovna fit into this? Kovna is Vilna's kind of sister city. Further north, it's also Lita, from Lithuania from a Jewish perspective, right? The greatest rabbi of the second half of the 19th century, Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, was the rabbi of Kovna, right? Yeshiva University's theological seminary, its rabbinical seminary, is named the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. That's after Rabbi Isaac Elchanan of Kovna. Between the two world wars, the two cities are cut off from each other because Kovna belonged to a different country, belonged to independent Lithuania. It was the capital city of an independent Lithuania that was founded after World War I. The Lithuanians wanted to have Vilna, but they lost that war during World War I. And Vilna was in Poland between World War I and World War II. So these two sister cities have virtually no contact with each other for about 20 years between World War I and World War II. You couldn't send a letter from Vilna to Kovna directly by mail in those years. You would have to send it to a third country. So there are rare possibilities to cross the border on, every couple years. So Kovna is in many ways similar to Vilna, not as illustrious, of course, but in its basic features, quite similar. Last question I have here, though you're welcome to write more. Still have almost 10 minutes. What is the status of the Jewish quarter today? Well, that leads to the whole question of what about Jews in Vilnius today? The Jewish quarter has been restored to an extent. In other words, the old town, as Lithuanians called, have been restored. They put up an arch and a couple of arches on that street to make it look like it once looked. The great source of controversy and uncertainty is what to do about the Great Synagogue. That Synagogue Courtyard and the Great Synagogue was destroyed, not so much by the Nazis, but actually by the Soviets after the war. But the Great Synagogue was torn down by the Soviets. And the question has been whether to recreate a Great Synagogue on that spot. Right now, that spot is occupied by a kindergarten, not a Jewish kindergarten, just a plain public kindergarten, and there's very little that's on the spot to commemorate the fact that this was once the heart of Jewish Vilna. There is a little bust of the Vilna Gaon nearby. So there have been some attempts to pay tribute to the Jewish character of that area. Not enough from a Jewish perspective, but there are very few Jews left in Vilnius today, 2,000, 3,000. There's not, and the Jews don't live there. That part of town now there are some cafes, restaurants, hotels. It's very nice looking, old looking, sort of Krakow in miniature. That's the Jewish quarter today. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. I can't read this one. When did Vilna become independent? Okay, well, some of these. Kalta Litvak, is its source Hasidic or Haskalah? Hasidic. In other words, there are regional stereotypes in East European Jewry, and Jews from other regions look at Litvaks and say, you're cold. You're just, you have no heart. Of course, Hasidim, with all their emotion and enthusiasm and warmth, see themselves as definitely as having a heart, and Litvaks as not having a heart. So that's definitely predates the Haskalah. In fact, the Haskalah is just as cold in some ways as the rabbinic tradition in Vilna, just as intellectual and unemotional. All right, some things. Yes, when did Vilna become independent? Who?
Was able to save so many Jews at the beginning of World War II.
Why were so many Jews from Lithuania saved at the beginning of World War?
Saved so many Jews of all those little shtetl, all those cities, able to come to Vilna because Vilna became independent. So what year was that?
Okay, I'll explain a little bit better. What happened? Okay, and I won't have to go through this at the next talk. All right, this is actually important. even for my next talk, which is in 1939, Vilna was not invaded by the Germans, by the Nazis. In 1939, Vilna was invaded from the other direction, from the Soviet Union. The Red Army came into Vilna in 1930. The Germans only came in 1941, June 1941, when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. So those almost 2 years between the beginning of World War II, September 1939, and June 1941, are rather complicated. The Red Army came in, and then in a surprise move, they handed Vilna over to independent Lithuania. Pre-existing, there was already an independent Lithuania, but they didn't have Vilna. And the Soviets gave it as a present to the Lithuanians. So Vilna belonged to independent Lithuania for about 9 months. Those 9 months are very crucial because independent Lithuania was neutral in the war. It was not with the Nazis, it was not with the Soviets, it was not with anybody. It was neutral. And Jewish refugees from all over Eastern Europe, if they could, fled to Vilna because they thought from that independent, neutral country they could move on to somewhere else. And so that people like Menachem Begin, who then lived in Warsaw, got to Vilna. He wanted to move on. Well, he wasn't lucky. He got arrested by the Soviets. But still, the many political leaders of different movements in the fall of 39, if they had a chance, fled to Vilna. And as you may know, the whole story of Sugihara, of the Japanese consul in Lithuania, who got a lot of people out, that was possible because it was Lithuania. It was independent Lithuania for those 9 months. Of course, then in June 1940, the Soviets had some regrets, and they incorporated this independent Lithuania into the Soviet Union as the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. And so it was only a 9-month window during which Jews could flee to Vilna, and through Vilna and Kovna, it's the same country at that point, could leave for elsewhere. Right, the Mir Yeshiva, other yeshivas were able to leave through independent Lithuania. Okay, one question's easy to answer because I'm not going to answer it. What happened to the Strashon library in and after the Shoah? That's the topic of my second talk, so I'm not going to answer that now. How do you spell the Ger Tzedek's family name? Potocki, P-O-T-O-C-K-I, Potocki. Last thing, if I can, how do you explain Vilnius's history of Holocaust victimhood? Well, I don't know if I can explain it. That would be a big topic. Let me hold off on that one also until after the second talk. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. And thank you for your interesting questions. I wish there were more time. I will try to budget myself the same way this time. This talk, I sort of have to apologize to those who have read my book, because it's a condensed short version of my book, where really much of the best stuff I have to leave out because there isn't time to get into nuances, which is a great story of Jewish spiritual resistance. That is, of Jews resisting Nazi endeavors, not through arms, but through other kinds of activities. The rescue of, in this case, the rescue of books and cultural treasures. Okay, like any good teacher, and I'm sure many of you here are teachers, I begin by review, right? So I'm going to quickly move through some basic features I mentioned last time, but with a somewhat different emphasis. Right, this is the book. You now know where Vilna is between the wars, on the northeastern tip. Let's see if we can get it. But now I can't see it, but it's up in that area. Of Poland, the Vilna Gaon. I just want to, in the book I refer to Vilna as the city of the book. This is the great center of Hebrew printing in the 19th century, and one of the great centers of Yiddish printing in the 20th century. So at its peak, there were in Vilna, between the two world wars, 5 Yiddish daily newspapers. Now think about that for a minute. 70,000 Jews and 5 daily Yiddish newspapers. One of the things it tells you many things. One is, well, Vilna newspapers are being read in other cities, not only in Vilna. These are not just local papers. It also tells you, though, this is a community of readers. People are reading, just about everybody's reading at least one and maybe more than one Yiddish daily. It also tells you, I'll be quite honest with you, the politically fragmented nature of this community. You've got a left of center paper, we can call it a socialist paper. You've got a Zionist paper, you've got a religious paper, you've got a nonpartisan paper, you've got a, what do we call it, tabloid, an afternoon paper, and that's how you end up with 5. Okay, now I've given you a different angle of the Great Synagogue in the background, in the Strashun Library, the community library in the front. This is the reading room, again, of the Strashun Library. A few things about the Strashun Library. I talked about its genesis, coming from this private collection of Matityahu Strashun last time. I guess the way to begin is to say 2 very important symbolic things. It's on the community budget. You know, in America we would say Federation or UJA were paid for it. 2 very important symbolic things. One, where they built it. They built it literally as an attachment to the Great Synagogue. They built that building around the 1900. It was open. The building was open in 1902. And that was a very important statement. In other words, the community library is a kind of sanctuary. It's a kind of holy place. We're not putting it somewhere else. We're putting it right attached to the oldest and holiest site in Vilna, the Great Synagogue. So the location was very importantly symbolic. The second thing that was importantly symbolic was the library was open 7 days a week. That's right, the library was open on Shabbos afternoon. You could not take notes in the library reading room on Shabbos. But if you ordered a book before the Sabbath, you could come in, ask for the book, sit down in the reading room and read. And the reason that was done, to have it open 7 days a week, was again to make a symbolic statement that reading and study and books are an integral part of life. There's no day off from that. And therefore, it should be open. Actually, the only days it was closed was on the high holidays. Other than that, it was always open. Again, this is a library, not a house of study. You know, it's got all kinds of Jewish books, mainly in Hebrew, a lot in Yiddish, some in Russian and other European languages. It's not just the Talmud. It's, you know, Hebrew newspapers, Yiddish newspapers, poetry, and of course the readership was quite diverse, men and women, some covering their heads, many not. In fact, the library was one of those places in the Vilna community where the different types of Jews met, or at least sat next to each other. There were about 100 seats in the reading room, and sometimes, especially in the evenings, there was a line, and people took a number on a waiting list to get a seat, and younger readers would just read books leaning against the wall. So this is, again, getting back to the theme of the intellectual attachments of this community. It had many rarities from the 16th century, books printed in Venice and other Italian cities in the 1500s, when first major centers of Hebrew printing. It even had 5 incunabula. Incunabula are books printed before 1500. Books printed before 1500 are very rare because printing only came into being in the early 1400s. 5 Hebrew incunabula in this library. So that's one great Jewish collection in Vilna. The second great collection is the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which had certainly the best Yiddish library anywhere in the world. And maybe even more important than the library, it had a great archive. It collected the records of community organizations, of communities. I'm always afraid to ask, but many of you belong to synagogues or organizations. I always worry, what happens to their records, to their correspondence, to their minutes, to their financial records? A lot of organizations throw those things out, unfortunately, and that means future historians won't be able to study them. YIVO collected those kinds of records of Zionist organizations, socialist organizations, synagogues, communities. It also collected ephemera. Ephemera is stuff that we throw away, like a synagogue newsletter. Maybe we look at it when we go to the shul, and we throw it out. Again, it's lost. They collected that. Or posters for theater performances. So a lot of things that people threw out were kept in this archive. They collected folklore. It was very rich as far as manuscripts, letters by writers in this YIVO archive. So we've got Strashun, we've got YIVO, and we've got many other collections. I'm not going to spend, there's a Jewish museum in Vilna. There were Yiddish and Hebrew teacher seminaries. There are synagogues, and there are individuals. When you got a city with scholars and writers and rabbis, they've got private libraries that have rare and valuable things. And that's why, in terms of books, probably there's no other community in Eastern Europe that had more and more valuable material than Vilna on the eve of the war. And yes, the writers, Jung Vilna as well. Well, wait a minute, I gotta go back, because two of the writers will be very important for our story, and those are these two writers in the middle. Poets, both of them. Shmerke Kaczerginsky, Shmerke, and Avrom Sutzkever, Avrom Sutzkever. Just quickly, Justin will fill in much more. Shmerke Kaczerginsky is an amazing biography. Shmerke is easy. There you got it. Shmerke was born in Vilna, but he was orphaned during World War I. Both his parents died of disease in World War I. He lives with, when he's 5 or 6 years old, he lives with a grandparent. Basically, he's sent to an orphanage. He lives in an orphanage and goes to the community-sponsored school for poor children, the Talmud Torah. So it's an amazing story of someone who ends up, basically with nobody and with nothing, ending up being a writer, a poet, an editor, person of letters, which is an extraordinary biography. He also, besides being a writer, couldn't make a living off of that, he's a worker. He worked in a print shop. And he becomes active in the labor movement and in the underground Communist Party in Poland. He is a communist before the war. His good buddy, his closest friend, Avrom Sutzkever, has a very different biography. His grandfather was a rabbi. He comes from a middle-class kind of family. He went to a private school, private high school. And he is apolitical. He is an aesthete. He writes nature poetry. He actually spent his childhood in Siberia, which he experienced as this beautiful winter wonderland. So he has lots of poems on the snow. But he is, once said, I'm not a Zionist, I'm not a socialist. The only thing I believe in is poetry. And they will be central to our story. Okay, now to get into the story. The Vilna Ghetto. The Germans literally seized Vilna on the second day of the war. They attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. By June 24, they are in control of Vilna. At the time, there are 70,000 Jews. There are a couple of months of chaos and snatchings. Talk about that in a minute. And then in September 1941, very early September, they create the Vilna Ghetto. Actually, the Germans created two Vilna Ghettos. The main one, Ghetto number 1, and the smaller one, Ghetto number 2. Ghetto number 2 was short-lived. It only existed for 2 months. Ghetto number 1, on the other hand, the main ghetto, will exist for almost 2 years, till September 1943. Now, here I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Vilna Ghetto in a nutshell. It's very different than the Warsaw Ghetto. And the model of the Warsaw Ghetto that we know is basically our paradigm of what we think ghettos were like. But Vilna really goes against the grain of that paradigm, because the story of the Warsaw Ghetto is of a downward trajectory. That is, the Germans create the ghetto, there is hunger and disease. In 1941, 10% of the Warsaw Ghetto died just from disease and hunger. There were no deportations anywhere in 1941 from the Warsaw Ghetto, but the conditions were so bad, there are different social classes, 10% simply die of starvation. And then by 1942, you start to get deportations. They grow. This is the Warsaw Ghetto, right? And then by 1943, when only a remnant of the ghetto, 10% of the original population is left, you get the Great Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right? So things get worse from 40, 41, 42, and then 43, the Uprising. The Vilna Ghetto is an entirely different story. What happens with the Vilna Ghetto is as follows. The Germans come in and immediately start, even before there's a ghetto, rounding up Jews from streets, from homes, and sending them off to places as yet unknown. It will then become known that these people, it will take a couple of months, that these people are being sent to a place on the outskirts of Vilna known as Ponar in Yiddish, or Ponari in Polish, or Panerai in Lithuanian. And that place on the outskirts of town, where there are these pits, they're being mowed down by machine gun. Right? This is happening, again, in the summer of 1941, and it will continue. The ghetto is created. By the time the ghetto is created in September 41, there are not 70 Jews in Vilna, 70,000 Jews. There are 40,000 Jews in Vilna. In other words, 30,000, almost a half, were murdered in 2-3 months. And then the ghetto is created. 40,000 go into the Vilna Ghetto, or the two Vilna Ghettos originally. And Jews originally thought maybe the ghetto will actually be safer than the way things were before. At least we're among fellow Jews, and maybe these roundups and raids will stop. Well, they were wrong. The roundups and raids continue through the end of 1941. So that on January 1, 1942, the end of the year, the Jewish population in the Vilna Ghetto is now 20,000. In other words, in 6 months, the Jewish population goes down from 70,000 to 20,000. Again, it's all about raids, roundups, and they're being deported not to Auschwitz or to some Treblinka or other kind of death camp. Those places don't even exist yet. They're being sent to the outskirts of town to be mowed down by machine gun. This is what's known as the Holocaust by bullets, right? Father Dubois, who has studied this in Ukraine. And then, in early 1942, the killings stop. The murdering teams, the Einsatzstabs, the Einsatzgruppen, move on, and the murdering stops. And it won't resume. In fact, the next year and a half will be what are known in the history of the Vilna Ghetto as the period of stability. Life is grim. You know, the food rations are very meager. Jews are being used as forced labor, slave labor for the Germans. There are all kinds of small, we call them small, in size, in quantity, atrocities. You know, Jewish women are forbidden to give birth, effective immediately. A lot of Jewish women were pregnant. When the babies, most of those babies, when they're born, are killed by the Germans immediately by poisoning. You know, there's a roundup of elderly, but was only a couple of hundred people. So there are all kinds of small atrocities, and everybody is traumatized because in those 6 months, everybody lost family and friends and neighbors, and everybody's afraid it's going to come back. But for the next year and a half, those massive raids and roundups do not happen. We have a period of stability. And so what I'm actually telling you, to get back to my comparison, is Vilna is worse than Warsaw and better than Warsaw. It is worse because the mass murdering happens immediately. And in fact, the underground in the Vilna Ghetto sends letters secretly to the Warsaw Ghetto to warn them. We don't know what's happening over in your place, but we know what's happening here, and what's happening here is probably going to happen where you are as well. And they're saying that in January of 1942, when there aren't yet any massive roundups or deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto. So it's worse in that sense. On the other hand, once the murdering stops, it does not resume on a major scale for the year and a half, and the Vilna Ghetto starts to, again, get into a kind of routine. And a very important part of that routine is reestablishing cultural life, which was so important to, it's a kind of resistance, right? In other words, we are human beings. We live. We're not animals. And therefore, these kind of demonstrations of our humanity, a concert, a school, right? A lecture, right? The Vilna Ghetto is famous for its cultural life as a way of a kind of moral resistance, which is we will hang in there, we will not lose our dignity, we will not lose our humanity, and we will hope and pray for the Red Army, for the Soviets to come and liberate us. That is the basic posture of most of the inhabitants of the Vilna Ghetto during that period of stability. This is the gate to the Vilna Ghetto. The sign says, one of the signs says, "Beware, Jews, danger of infection." In other words, Jews are like vermin. They're some kind of, infected creature, and everybody should avoid contact with them. Most ghetto inhabitants leave this gate daily for work. Work is outside the ghetto, in all kinds of places, as slave laborers, and they return at the end of the day. Of course, what most ghetto inmates want to do is smuggle in some food. The official rations are very meager. And generally speaking, smuggling food into the Vilna Ghetto was more successful than the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, there's a lot of food got through, and you don't have death by starvation in the Vilna Ghetto because through many devices, I don't have time to go into them, on both a retail and a wholesale scale. In other words, the ghetto administration, the Judenrat, had ways of smuggling in food. You don't have inhabitants starving. But on the individual level, smuggling in food means getting something while you're at work and then passing through this gate, where you'll be inspected by 2 or 3 different types of guards. There are Lithuanian police who are collaborating with the Nazis. There are Jewish police, that is ghetto police. And those 2 groups usually are not very, very strict in their body searches, except when the 3rd type of guard comes, and that's Germans. When Germans are at the gate, it can be a routine officer or it can be a very high-ranking official. Whenever a German comes to the gate, then the Lithuanians and the Jews both get very nervous and start body searching very, very thoroughly. And of course, the Germans also do body searching at the gate. And for smuggling in food, you can be sent to your death. And in fact, that happened many times. At the very least, you'll be whipped and badly beaten. But the case, just to bring this across, is of the singer, opera and classical singer, Lyuba Levitskaya, who was friends with the writers, who brought in a bag of peas. And the bag of peas was found on her body, and she was sent to her death for that bag of peas. Okay, now I need to get to our story proper. I probably spent too much time on background. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR. This is an agency for looting cultural treasures all across Europe. Not only Jew, all kinds, right? They were one of the agencies stealing art in Paris. And they're stealing, great books from libraries in Amsterdam and in Warsaw. They loot cultural treasures because the master race should have the master library. Period. It's part of the arrogance of the Nazi ideology. But they do have a department, a special department to loot Jewish cultural treasures. Not only ones belonging to Jews, but ones related to Jews and Judaism. Because they have a special interest there. In Nazi Germany, there's a field of scholarship called Judenforschung, study of the Jews. Basically, this is anti-Semitic Jewish studies by Nazi scholars who, through scholarship, will prove the evil and depravity of the Jews. Through scholarship, whether it's historical, anthropological, literary, they will show that the Jews must be ghettoized, and must eventually be exterminated. That's a very important field of Nazi scholarship. But in order to have such scholarship, they must have the raw data. The scholars have to have access to Jewish books and manuscripts and documents, and that's why they have a special Judaica department of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, of the ERR, to loot these kind of materials, send them on to specialized institutes that deal with this stuff back in Germany. This is the head of that department, Dr. Johannes Paul. Johannes Paul has a great story, a biography. He was raised devout Catholic. He became an ordained Catholic minister, Catholic priest, and then, as part of his advanced studies, he went to Jerusalem to study in a pontifical institute in Jerusalem. There in Jerusalem, he masters Hebrew, both biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew. He supposedly took some courses at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. This is between 1932 and 1934. Then he left back for Nazi Germany and changed his life. He's no longer, a Catholic priest. He gets married, and he has to find a new career. His new career is being a librarian and bibliographer, and he markets himself as a Judaica librarian and bibliographer. And basically, he commits himself to Nazism. And of course, all the previous Judaica bibliographers were Jews who had been fired from their jobs, so there's a market there. He gets a job, he rises, and he will become the top Judaica expert for the ERR and the librarian for the top institution of Judenforschung, the Institute for the Study, for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. And they loot, this group, they loot stuff everywhere. Paul travels all across Europe. He was in Salonika. He was in Paris. He was in Amsterdam. He was in Warsaw. He was in Kiev. But, and you can see, this is a book printed in Vilna, actually, but with the swastika, looted by the ERR for the Institute in Frankfurt. But Paul knows that when it comes to Jewish books, Vilna is maybe the jewel in the crown, or one of the jewels in the crown. And he comes to Vilna in July 1941, literally a couple of weeks after the German army had conquered the city, to get a lay of the land. He's looking, he knows about YIVO, he knows about the Strashun Library, he's looking. That first visit of his to Vilna, he realizes there's a lot more in Vilna than he expected. There are so many Jewish books, and he doesn't need 5 copies of the same book to be sent to Germany. And there's just too much to send. How is he going to handle that? And he comes to the conclusion, what he needs, there are not enough Germans like Johannes Paul to go through this stuff. So he needs a brigade of Jewish slave laborers to sort the material. What should be sent to Germany and what not. But within a month or two, the policy is whatever will not be sent to Germany will be sent to be destroyed. For a few months, they have another policy, then they switch. It's Germany or destruction. And so he creates such a team of Jewish slave laborers, which gets the nickname, Jews called them the Paper Brigade. Now I'm going to tell you the heroes of this story, main heroes. This is the main person of the Paper Brigade, Hermann Kruk. He's a Bundist, a socialist, actually not from Vilna, he was from Warsaw. He fled Warsaw in September 1939 when the Germans came in, and fled and made it to Vilna. He is a professional librarian. He had been the head of one of Warsaw's top Jewish libraries. He's also a real gentleman. People who knew him said, even in the ghetto, he always, filed his fingernails, and he always polished his shoes. And he actually has 2 jobs in the Vilna Ghetto. The other job, this is one of them, head of the Paper Brigade. The other job he has is heading the Vilna Ghetto Library. As it happens, there was a library on the territory of the Vilna Ghetto. It was purely coincidental. The Germans made a map. Jewish Vilna has so many libraries. That one Jewish library, not the top one, what happened to be in the territory of the ghetto, and he is appointed by the Judenrat to be director of the ghetto library, which becomes a very important institution. Again, it's a way the inmates assert their humanity, that they read books. And it's also a way to escape, not to think about all the problems. And even the library actually had a sign on the wall, saying, when you're hungry, read a book. To escape your troubles and your worries and your fear, read a book. In other words, it's a real method of survival under very dire circumstances, and he's got a staff of 18 people. In other words, what I'm actually telling you is Vilna remains Vilna even under the German occupation. This attachment to books is still there in this community now of 20,000 ghetto inmates. Okay, his deputy is Zelig Kalmanovich, a scholar from YIVO, from the Yiddish Institute. Kalmanovich went through many metamorphoses, but at this stage in his life, from the late 30s and into the ghetto, he is a Zionist. His son lives in Palestine, in the land of Israel. And he is a religious believer. He's a religious man. Nonetheless, even though he is in some ways ideologically the polar opposite of Kruk, the socialist and Bundist, they get along well. Their characters are very compatible, and their goals are totally in sync. And then they hire basically the remnants of Vilna's Jewish intellectual class. In other words, a lot of them are murdered. A lot of the writers and scholars and teachers have been already murdered. But those that are left, most of them get hired for this brigade. So you have a lot of educators. I would say about half of at its peak, you have 20 intellectuals working for this brigade, and 20 technical workers, people making boxes, lugging boxes, maintaining the building, cooking, whatever. 20 technical workers, but 20 intellectuals. I'd say about half of them are teachers or educators of different types. You also have the 2 poets that we mentioned before, the same Shmerke, the orphan turned communist, and Sutzkever, the grandson of the rabbi, the aesthete, who are hired for this brigade. And with them, a very special case is a high school teacher of history, Rachela Krinsky, She had a master's degree from Vilna University in history. She knew Latin. She knew Old German and Old Polish, very highly educated woman. She has a very special personal story because she entered the ghetto alone. Her husband had been killed right in July, in the very first roundups. They had a baby, a daughter, 18 months old. When the ghetto is formed, she hands over her baby to her Polish nanny and says, "You keep her. She'll be safer with you on the outside than with me in the ghetto." And the nanny takes her, raises that child as if it were a Catholic Polish child, takes her to church every Sunday. She won't see her daughter again, at least for the duration of the war. So her strength, her source of strength, is first of all her friends. She's friends with the poets Sutzkever and Kaczynski. And the other thing keeps her going is reading poetry. She loves to read poetry. So that's 5 examples of the 20 who work in this brigade. And the work is a work of sorting mountains and mountains of books and papers, what goes to Germany and what will be destroyed. They can't, this is a form of torture. In other words, you're forcing intellectuals and book lovers to destroy their own culture, right? To participate in the destruction of what they love the most. Or either destruction or looting, basically to be complicit in the looting of Jewish cultural treasures. So, in fact, Rachel Akrinsky originally says, "I didn't think I could take that job. I didn't think I could stand the sight of books being pushed like garbage by, bulldozers, by just thrown away into the trash." And that is why the vast majority, almost immediately come to the conclusion there must be another way. We have to rescue this material so that it's not looted and not destroyed. Right, if you need a simple picture that puts it all. Yes, hundreds of Torah scrolls, right? This is a piece of a Torah scroll made into an insert for a boot. In other words, after all, parchment is leather, it's strong. You can repair Nazi or military boots using pieces of Torah scrolls, right? And they're not willing to participate in that kind of desecration to the best of their ability. Things are sent on. The main way they rescue material is at the ghetto gate. They literally put books and papers under their clothing, in their shoes, around their torso, kind of diaper, and then they have to pass by inspection again. And if it's Germans, they're literally risking their lives. They do this, and if you want to calculate, again, this operation continued not for a day or for a month. It goes on for a year and a half. The Paper Brigade is operational for a year and a half. If you got 10 people, each of them bringing in, let's say, 4 things for, 400 days or work days, that's a lot, that's several thousand items that can be taken in over a year and a half. Of course, what happens at the gate, and there are many, cases of literally miraculous rescue at there. Nobody from the brigade was murdered, though many of them were beaten badly, but none of them were murdered because of the material they smuggled in. Let me explain that. That's my mistake. The work site, the building where they're working, is outside the ghetto, like just about all work sites. So they work outside the ghetto, and they want to bring the material into the ghetto, just like bringing food in, because in the ghetto, it's accessible. It's among Jews. It's safe. They know where it is, and they will always be able to retrieve it. So the goal is to bring this stuff back into the ghetto, where you can bury it underground, or you can put it in the wall somewhere, in a hiding place. There are about a dozen hiding places for books and papers inside the territory of the Vilna Ghetto. Right? This is a bunker inside the Vilna Ghetto, as drawn right after the war. Right? It goes 60 feet underground. It was built by a Jewish construction engineer. Right? It's got lighting. It's got even water, and you enter through a manhole and basically go underground. You had two types of things being kept in this bunker. You had books and papers, and you had arms, because there is an armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto, Abba Kovner, and they're planning a great Vilna Ghetto uprising. And so you have crates of books and crates of guns right next to each other, the two major forms of resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. And Sutzkever writes a poem about, he's a poet after all, so he writes a poem about this experience. What does it feel like to carry these treasures on your body and then to bury them in a bunker under the ground? And I'm not going to go through the poem with you, but the basic metaphor he uses is recalling that there was once an Egyptian pharaoh who asked grains of wheat to be buried next to him, his body, his mummy, in a pyramid. And they did that. And then thousands of years later, they open up his casket, they find the grains of wheat, and they plant it, and you get these stalks that grow out of those grains of wheat from thousands of years ago. And he says in the poem, that's what I believe, that eventually someone, I'm not burying this material, I'm planting it, and eventually it will be discovered, and eventually it will flourish, right? And like the primeval grain that turned into a stalk, the words will nourish, the words will belong to the people in its eternal walk. So it's this great act of faith. We will probably all die, but at least these books will survive, and if they survive, then the core and essence of what Vilna was about will survive. Another way they rescued material was with non-Jewish friends. There was one advantage to this work site, and it was that the Germans didn't supervise it very tightly, and they left for the lunch hour. The Germans left for lunch. And there was a Polish guard, but not very smart, not very interested. So there really was there were no military guards at this work site. So in lunch hour, non-Jewish friends could come to the work site, talk with the inmates, give them a little bit of food, give them encouragement and news, and some of them would take away books and papers to their own homes, hide them outside the ghetto. This is Anna Shemaitya, an ethnic Lithuanian, a professional librarian. She was a librarian at the Vilna University Library. She knew many of these members of the Paper Brigade from before the war when they visited the university library. She came, took stuff, hid a lot at her apartment. She did more than that. Anna Shemaitya actually went into the Vilna Ghetto several times and met inmates in the ghetto. How did she do that? She went over to the guards, the Lithuanian and German guards, and said, I'm a librarian at the university library. These inmates have overdue library books. They took them from our library, and then they went into the ghetto, and I got to collect them. And so they said, okay. They let her into the ghetto. And many times the inmates would smuggle stuff into the ghetto, would then give it to her. She'd take it out. These are the overdue library books. That way she hid a lot of things in a lot of places. The last time Anna Shemaitya was in the Vilna Ghetto, instead of taking out books, she took out a little girl and hid that girl in her home. And that girl survived, went to Israel. Anna Shemaitya was recognized as a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. Right after the institution was created in the 1960s, she was recognized as Michsidei Umot HaOlam, a righteous Gentile. Okay, I'm going into too much detail, but let me move on. The poets survive. Both of them had been members of the armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto, and thanks to that status, when the members of the armed resistance decided there would not be a Vilna Ghetto uprising, they were able to leave for the forests. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski both left for the forests and were fighters from the forests and survive. The main heads of this brigade, the librarian Kruk, the scholar Kalmanovich of Yivo, both of them perish in camps in Estonia. Rachela Krinsky, the high school teacher, survives just barely. She is deported to camps, all kinds of camps. The main camp she was at was this camp called Stutthof, which is not very famous, but deserves to be more famous. It was originally a labor camp, but then it became a death camp. Stutthof had a crematorium. It became a death camp. It became an overflow camp for Auschwitz. In 1944, there were just too many Hungarian Jews. Auschwitz can't process all of them. Many of the Hungarian Jews were sent to Stutthof. She's always sitting there expecting that she's next, looking at the smoke coming from the crematorium. Her turn didn't come. She did survive. And she survives as a very deeply broken and depressed person. She writes letters to Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, the poets, her friends, and basically says, I really didn't deserve to survive. I don't know what to make of this new life. She doesn't even write to her brother. She has a brother in New York, and she says, I didn't write to him. I don't see why I should. The only thing she wants in life, that she does want, is to see her daughter. And her daughter is back in Vilna with her nanny, and she writes to the nanny and says, actually, I should explain, she writes to Sutzkever, I want to see my daughter, maybe she will help me. And she immediately catches herself, understands what she just said. Not that I can help my daughter, not that I can be of any use to my daughter. The nanny is a much better mother than anything I can do for my daughter. But maybe my daughter will help me, that I can have some sense of meaning and purpose in my life. She will try to get that daughter to leave from Vilna after the war to meet her in Points West. I'll come back to that and explain. So the poets come back to Vilna. It's a ruin. This is the Synagogue of the Vilna Gaon in ruins. This is the Yivo building in ruins. And they're coming back not to look for family, not to look for friends, not to look for property. They don't want their apartment back. They're coming only back to finish the job of the Paper Brigade and to find the buried books and papers. And they begin a major retrieval operation. They collect other survivors, other former partisans, whoever's coming in. They don't have much. They have wooden hand wagons, and they start digging. The main bunker I described to you was actually survived intact. The papers and books in that bunker did survive, and it's a major retrieval. Some of them, they just have their bare hands. Sometimes they're lucky they have a little bit of a shovel. And yes, they find Torah scrolls. Again, that's Sutzkever in the middle, and that's Abba Kovner, who was the leader of the armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto on the right. He joins in this retrieval operation. And there's Shmerke, the other poet, with all kinds of art and mountains of newspapers. And they create in Vilna a Jewish museum, right after the war. Not even after the war, but during the war, but after the liberation of Vilna in July 1944. This museum that they found immediately encounters all kinds of difficulties because liberated Vilna is part of the Soviet Union, and that has lots of consequences. They have a building. It's literally the building of the ghetto library it's empty, and it's in ruins, but it can still be used. And they use that building as their museum, but Mikhail Suslov, the main Soviet official then in Lithuania, is opposed to having things like Jewish museums in Vilnius. They can't get glass. They can't get salaries. They can't get any kind of cooperation. They can't even get an exemption from the military. In other words, they could be drafted at any moment. It is a war of nerves between these survivors and the Soviet authorities. And it comes to a head in two important events. One is, a lot of the material that was rescued was kept outdoors. There was not enough space in the building, in courtyards. A lot of material was found at the Vilnius Trash Administration. This is stuff the Germans were going to send away, but the Germans left before they could send it away. And the museum says to the trash administration, hold on to this stuff for a couple of weeks. We don't have anywhere to put it right now. But then the trash administration sends it all away as trash. And when that happens, the poets realize the Soviets are no better than the Nazis when it comes to Jewish cultural treasures. They'll destroy it. They are destroying it. And then KGB agents walk into the museum and say, I know you have a lot of books and papers here. You know this is the Soviet Union where we have censorship. You can't show anything to anyone until it passes censorship. Every book, every paper. And the poets say, okay, do you have any censors who can review our material? And the Soviet officials say, no. That's a cold no, meaning no, and we don't intend to, and we don't give a damn. And they realize the material is in threat of being destroyed, and at the very best, it will be imprisoned. It must be taken out of the Soviet Union, or else it will be useless. And I can't go through all the details, but they go through, cross the border. They've got stuff that they take in suitcases across the border from Soviet Lithuania to Poland. And they get into Poland, but then there are pogroms in Poland, and they've got to take the material out of Poland. Eventually, this material will overwhelmingly end up either in New York, at the YIVO Institute in New York, because the branch of YIVO in New York became its headquarters during the war. So they send it to New York, and much of it is taken to Israel. Much of it's at the National Library and at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Rachel Akrinsky did reunite with her daughter. The nanny brought the daughter to Poland. Rachel went to Poland. And gradually they rebonded. It's a very tough problem because this girl had not seen her mother in 4 years. She was under 2 years old when she separated from her mother. Nanny is her mother. She calls her mother Madam. But it takes time, and they do rebond. The Jewish Museum is closed. The Soviets win that one, obviously. All the material is scattered among different repositories, Soviet Lithuanian repositories. Most of it will be in this former church, St. George's Church, basically in piles for 40 years. What are the materials they rescued? Just going to give you some examples. A diary by Theodore Herzl, the record book of a synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. It spans more than 150 years, that record book. All kinds of rare little booklets. I like the one on the right, Prayers for Childbirth. And these are tchenis, prayers in Yiddish for women. What is a woman to do before there are epidurals? And it's a difficult birth. The only thing you can do is pray. Right? All kinds of synagogue art and ornaments. Letters by Sholem Aleichem. And they also rescued material from their own, this is a bust of Leon Tolstoy. And they also rescue material from their own period, from the ghetto period. A program of a concert of the Vilna Ghetto Symphony Orchestra. A call to arms from the armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. Okay, to wrap up, Sutzkever and Kaczynski part ways. Sutzkever leaves for Palestine, even before it's a state of Israel. Fights in the Israeli War of Independence, has an illustrious career as a Yiddish poet in Israel. Among his readers are Golda Meir and Israeli President Zalman Shazar. He'll live a long and fruitful life. Kaczynski, no longer a communist, that experience had totally disillusioned him about what communism was. He ends up settling in Argentina to head a cultural organization there. Tragically, he dies in an airplane crash in 1954. In other words, he survived Hitler, he survived Stalin, and in a fluke crash dies. Rachel Akrinsky came to America. She had a brother in New York. And she marries, something she never expected when she was liberated from the camps. She raised her daughter got married. Her granddaughter, Alex, lives in Berkeley, California today. So it's an inspiring story of people who are willing to literally risk their lives, not once and not even twice, but many, many times, for the heritage of Vilna, for Jewish cultural and religious heritage, and who, in a small way, you could say, succeeded. Thank you.
It's my great honor and pleasure now to introduce Professor Justin Cammy, who will speak with us about Avrom Sutzkever's memoir, which I know is going to be a very powerful topic. Please help me in welcoming Professor Justin Cammy.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to New York. I've never been here before. Kidding, I'm kidding. But I drove in from beautiful Western Massachusetts this morning, and it's always good to be back in the city, and especially here.
I think I need to turn this on. Is it on? There we go. Okay.
Good? Can you hear me now? Perfect? Great. So I've spent the better part of the last year gravitating between two worlds that Professor Fishman has already alluded to in both of his talks. Some days I spend time finishing a manuscript I'm working on the Yiddish poets and journalists and prose writers of the literary group Old Vilna from the 1930s, sort of reimagining and living in a world when, as I see it, or I'm trying to theoretically frame it, Yiddish was young. That is, all of the attitudes that we might bring to Yiddish now as somehow being of the past or belonging to grandparents or somehow dying or dead, all of these false tropes that are pushed onto Yiddish. This was the furthest thing from the truth for those who actually gave birth in Yiddish or lived in Yiddish or went to school in Yiddish or were in choirs in Yiddish or played soccer in Yiddish. And that's what that book is going to try to do and excavate. On the other hand, I've been spending my mornings for the past year, usually before my children wake up, translating Avrom Sutzkever's diary of the Vilna Ghetto from Yiddish into English. And even though I've taught courses on Holocaust literature and Holocaust history, and even though I was trained as a scholar of Yiddish, and so I certainly know about these events, the more I read every morning and sort of do 2, 3, 4 pages to keep disciplined, the more I'm both horrified and amazed by some of the things that we heard earlier by Professor Fishman. So what I want to do this afternoon, is really bridge two of the topics that he brought up. One is this idea of Vilna as a Jewish city, and I want to rehearse some of the things that he talked about, perhaps going back to one of the poems he mentioned, but building on that into a pyramid of talking and writing about Vilna, and then spending a little bit of time talking briefly about the memoir that I'm translating and that I hope to be able to submit by the end of the year for publication, and some of the challenges I've had in thinking about not only what it means to publish a memoir, Holocaust memoir, but also specifically this Holocaust memoir. So this is a picture of Avrom Sutzkever, another picture of him from the ghetto years. We'll come back to these pictures, but first, we saw this a few moments ago, this very famous song that we talked about as being written in the United States and then being exported back to Vilna and then being taken up as sort of a community anthem. And one of the interesting things that, do any of you know this song? The tune to this song? Oh, can I sing it? I can sing part of it. I wasn't expecting to perform today, but if necessary, it goes like this. We'll do the first, just the first few stanzas. Vilne, Stadt von Geist und Mimes, Vilne, jiddischlech Vertracht, wo es murmeln stielet vieles, stille Säudes von der Nacht. Oftmals seh ich dir in Cholem. And now I can't even read. Heis geliebte will nicht mein, und in die alte Vilna Ghetto, in a näppeldicken Schein. And now the chorus. Vilne, Vilne, unser Heimstadt, unser Bänkschaft unbager. Acht, wie oft es ruft dein Namen von mein Euphoreuser Trär. Vilner Gesslich, Vilner Teichen, Vilner Werder Barg und Toll, Eppes Neuet, Eppes beng sich noch a Zeiten von amol. So, we'll be taking it on the road soon. Though not a literary masterpiece, and this was first crafted in 1934, I want to suggest that this represents a common trope of poetic writing about Vilna, embracing many of its core elements that we see. First of all, this poem sets up Vilna as both a real place and as a dream place. That is a place that exists in material reality, but also as a concept that something can still be aspired to. The Old Vilna Ghetto, you'll notice, is foggy. It exists in a foggy glow. And when you think of that as a poetic image, normally something that glows is not also foggy. That is, there's something contradictory about that embraces certain things that are coming up against one another. It's both murky, but it's also a source of great inspiration that one seeks through that murkiness. The reference to the dual legacies of Vilna in this poem, the traditional and the modern, the religious and the political. It speaks of the Old Vilna Ghetto, right? And we're talking about 1934, not the Vilna Ghetto of the Nazis, but the Vilna Ghetto that was the area where Jews lived, the old part of Vilna, especially the religious part, of prayer, of the flag, but then it also talks about the flag of freedom that we heard about earlier, namely referencing the vibrant contradictory politics of the moment, whether it be the Bund, or territorialism, or communism, or Zionism. That is, that concept, this idea of the flag of freedom is both vague enough to be an umbrella to encompass all political movements of the time. It also Judaizes space. This is something that scholars of Yiddish literature learned very early on when reading about Sholem Aleichem and Sholem Aleichem's construction of Jewish space in Yiddish literature. Namely, that you read this poem about Vilna, this song about Vilna, and there are no non-Jews there. There are no non-Jews mentioned. So in a way, it creates not only a mythopoetics of a Jewish city, but it also Judaizes a city and in fact makes it almost a totalizing Jewish space. We heard earlier from David that this word in the second line, a Yiddishlich vertracht, right? Jewishly conceived. But of course, the word Yiddish, it means both Jewish, but it also references a specific language. So it's also somewhat amorphous in the sense that it could be something that's Jewishly thought through, Jewishly, endowed, Jewishly sated, but it could also be a reference to the fact that Yiddish itself forms one of the constitutive elements of local civic culture and pride. So this is one of the great sentimental contributions to, I think, the Yiddish song repertoire. I think the only other one that's as popular or perhaps more well-known is the song about bells, right? Bells, Landstädtle bells. So when you think of how song and how anthems, in a way, create a sense of nationalism, here we have a sense of civic nationalism, or we might want to call local or urban nationalism. And this became one of the ways that Vilna exported its culture way in excess of its demographics. So if we heard earlier that if Warsaw had the demographic heft of Polish Jewry, I think what we were learning about before is that Vilna had the spiritual and cultural heft. And this was one of the way that was built. Now the real question I think that vexes scholars, or some scholars, is why do some centers elicit rather slim poetic attention, whereas others encourage constant revisiting? That is, more specifically, how was this image of Vilna self-consciously crafted, even constructed, in the interwar period by its native poets to produce an image of the city as the cultural capital of a transnational Yiddishland? And one of the ways that intellectuals spoke about this at the time was by exporting this idea of Nusach Vilna. So those of us who are familiar with religious terminology understand that a nusach is a certain way of doing something, whether it be a way of cantillating or a way of learning. But here there was this idea that the city itself had a way of being. And not just a religious way of being, but that all Jews could somehow coalesce around certain ideas that gave them pride. That is, it didn't matter whether you were a secular Jew or a religious Jew in Vilna in the interwar period. Even if you were a secular Jew, you had respect for the Vilna Gaon as a community member. This was something that was part of the DNA the cultural DNA of the city. And this was part of Nusach Vilna. And one of the things that I'm always so interested in is that later on, it was none other than Max Weinreich, the director of the YIVO Institute, who comments that Vilna was the only Polish city that had both tradition and modernity. Of course, other Polish cities had that, but what he meant by that was the second part of that phrase. He then accentuated the fact that Vilna had, quote, genius of place. And I love this idea of why is it that some places have genius even when they don't necessarily have economic power or demographic power, whereas other places may have all those things, but simply fall flatter. And part of that genius of place meant that, like that song that's up here right now, there was an entire generation of writers and thinkers and intellectuals and scholars who crafted very, very carefully that myth of Vilna over the years. And that's what I want to just look at for a few minutes. Part of this exists even before the poetic form, but still in textual form, through the vast tradition of almanacs and Sammelbücher, literally texts that collected and transmitted communal history and information about this city, going back really to the, if we're talking really about the Maskilic period, to the 19th century. So we have in Hebrew, Kiryah Ne'emanah, which really marks Vilna as a Maskilic center. Then we have Yosef Klausner's Toldot Yisrael Bevilna, which covers the period of the 18th century. Vilna pioneered, or was among the pioneers of the Sammelbücher genre in Yiddish literature, was the first community in Eastern Europe to produce its own Sammelbuch, and several were produced between World War I and World War II. During World War I, 1916 to 18, we have the Vilner Sammelbuch that's being published, which marked a new type of local historiography. Then in 1922, immediately after the war, very soon after Vilna becomes a Polish city, we have Pincus, von der Geschichte von Vilna in die Jahren von Milchome und Okkupation, right? The history of Vilna in the years of war and occupation. Then in 1935, here in New York, we have expats producing Vilna, a Sammelbuch dedicated to the city. And in 1939, we have not one, but two. The Vilna Almanach that's published in 1939, and then my favorite, yet to be translated, Zalmanschik's Tausend Jahre Vilna, 1939. So we have all of these histories of this still relatively small community that then build on this idea of self-chronicling, of anthologizing, of interest, not only in what one is, but what one does as a collectivity and as a community. This local patriotism that really helped to forge this image of Vilna as an important place, not only for those who live there, but for the entire Yiddish-speaking and perhaps even the entire Jewish world. And Yiddish poetry was part of that effort to both conceive and then later to provide a counter image or to push back against that myth. And when we go to the second major text, we have my most beloved poet of the 1920s, the poet Moshe Kulbach, who worked in various places, among them Berlin, eventually went across the border and became a Soviet poet and found himself purged by Stalin. But he has and writes a poem published ironically in Warsaw in 1927 called Vilna. And in this poem, we find something very, very interesting. What it does is it clears space, it clears intellectual and, most important, creative and artistic space for inviting the poets of Young Vilna, who will appear only a few years later, to read home as text, to be able to read place as text. And if we just look at those initial first lines, we see that in this poem, he says that you are like a psalm. Right? He doesn't say you are like a psalm. He says you are a psalm, spelled in clay and iron. Now, those are two very, very different elements. When you think of clay, clay is malleable, clay is old, clay can fall apart, clay can break, it's something that needs to be protected. And iron is something that is very strong, something that's forged, perhaps something that we would see as quite contemporary. So this idea that you could have one poet who says that the city is not like a psalm, but is a psalm. That is, it's something to be praised, and it's something to be read, and it's something to be sung, and it is both malleable and fixed. It is both old and contemporary. It is both modern and it is both ancient at one and the same time. And it was Kulbach, more than any other poet that I know of, who not only marked Yiddish literature through this, but actually taught what he marked. That is, he taught in the Yiddish schools, the Yiddish high school of Vilna, and became a teacher to an entire generation of aspiring poets. Now, what is odd about this poem, this expressionist poem, is that the dominant colors of this poem and the dominant tone of the poem, for most of it, is gray. Most of the time, I don't know about you, but if I were trying to build a color palette of something that was sunny and positive and exciting and nurturing, gray would not necessarily be the first color that I chose. But we have to put ourselves into an interwar Eastern European mindset to recognize that for Kulbach, gray was the color of everything, right? It could include red culture, it could include Soviet culture, it could include Zionist culture, right? Because gray can be both have red elements, it can have blue elements. Gray, that is, you can project onto gray the entirety of the community. And so much of this poem is funereal, is gray, and then at a certain point, the anxiety of what he's writing about shifts, the dark mood shifts. This is where Nusach Vilna really comes in. So that by the end, you almost have a Whitman-esque Kulbach writing about Vilna and talking about Vilna, where he says, Ich bin das Greu, ich bin der schwarzer Flamm, ich bin die Stadt. It's like, I am the grayness, the city is me and I am the city. I am the black flame, but a flame that burns, and I am the city itself. This completely excited the young writers who would come after them, because it set out, like we saw in the poem, the song that would come soon thereafter in 1934, it marked Vilna as an entirely Jewish city. It marked Vilna as something that could be praised and something that could be critiqued simultaneously. It included all of the political complexity and religious complexity and let's say the dynamics of the city, the stuff of the city, of the cultural life at one and the same time. And he was able to transform it overnight into a substantial text, and a substantive text, such that by 1929, 2 years after the text is published, you have this generation of young Yiddish writers and poets and thinkers under the banner of young Vilna, coming into their own, who already recognize that the city's name, the city's reputation outside of Vilna already is free advertising for what they are going to do within Vilna. Right? They don't have to pay for that advertising because everyone reading them outside says, well, if they're from Vilna, they must have something to say. Because Vilna has always had something to say. It's always been a dynamic leader. But they're modernists, and they don't just want to be part of the establishment. No young people these days, certainly not young Jews, want to follow necessarily in their parents' or in their grandparents' footsteps. So you have an entire counter-reaction to this in their poets. And one of the poets who is unknown really still in the Yiddish world, let alone in the outside world, is a poet by the name of Lazer Wolf, who adopts this as a pen name, steals it really from Sholem Aleichem, a character in Sholem Aleichem's Tevye, and he writes a poem called Vilner Schulhof, the Vilna Synagogue Courtyard, the same synagogue courtyard that we heard about in our first and second lectures today. But what is this poem? It's not a poem where he's saying, oh, look how beautiful, how wonderful this synagogue courtyard is. We have a synagogue, we have the Gaon of Vilna's Stiebel, we have the Strashun library. No, it's a way of them wrestling with the burden of inheritance, claiming and also wrestling and also rejecting and also making fun of that at one and the same point. So at a certain point early on in the poem, he's talking about how we have so many different klois, so many different study houses, so many different spaces. We even in Vilna have a klois just for people who suffer from hemorrhoids. Right, so this is the type of parody that by that point they're able to wrestle with, a parody and a writing that in some ways is anti-romantic, at the same time that it recognizes that people in Vilna and beyond Vilna want to see texts written about the city itself. And by the time we get to the war, and by the time we get to Avrom Sutzkever, Sutzkever himself, as we heard earlier, was the least political of all of the young Vilna poets. If Kaczerginski, on the one hand, was the most engagé, as both a member of the underground Communist Party, as someone who was willing to get arrested, as sort of the ringleader and cheerleader and organizer of young Vilna, even though he was friends with Sutzkever, when he tells and encourages, and Laser-Wolf encourages Sutzkever to apply for membership in Young Vilna, Sutzkever, who goes on to become the most well-known and the greatest poet of the post-war period, he is rejected from Young Vilna because he's not engagé enough. And they say, we don't need you. We don't need writing about trees. We don't need writing about snow. We don't need writing about snowflakes. We don't need your poems that talk about all of my eyes are in you and all of my yous are in I. What does this mean for people who are battling certain things and need to have a vision for life? But nonetheless, what's ironic or perhaps fated is that the least politically engaged member of Young Vilna in the 1930s really becomes one of the great poets of the Churban, of the Holocaust during the war. And there are so many things, so many ways that Sutzkever writes poetically, really poems that are part of the mythopoetics of destruction and also of survival. And just as a counterpoint to what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, one of my favorite poems that he writes is this poem that he dates 1943, 1944. That would be the period after he escapes from the ghetto and is spending time either in the forest, the Naroch forest, or by that time in Moscow. And he writes about Vilna again. And he, in the mood or in the mode of Kulbach, having learned from Kulbach. And we see from this poem and the way it begins, "Oh, not to mourn for you, I come, city of my song." Such an amazing opening, right? And he goes on and talks about how he wants to incorporate the entirety of Vilna existence that existed prior to the war into himself. And I'll quote a stanza here. He's speaking, the speaker is speaking to the city. "I want to enter you like a night with glowing stars, to shine in every house, standing and destroyed, into faces, living or not, because for me they live. For as a person feels his arm that has just been cut off, and feels the golden ring on a severed finger, so I still feel the link with all those houses and friends." It's amazing, that sort of this idea that which no longer exists still is alive nonetheless. And he'll go on in the second stanza, almost like a love, it is a love poem. "You are my first love, and my first love you will remain. And I will carry your name throughout the world as my ancestors bore the holy ark on their shoulders." That's a pretty strong image to say, in the same way that the Mishkan was carried, that's how I will carry you wherever history takes me, and I will never leave you. But he also offers a warning in 1943 and 1944. He offers both a Kulbachian turn, where he claims that he's part of the city, but then he condemns the bystanders and the perpetrators and those who have now moved in to formerly Jewish homes that have simply been now have been emptied. And he has a vision, I think, for a post-Holocaust reality that is very, very raw at that moment. Right? We talked a little bit, someone asked earlier about what the area around the Vilna, the former old part of Vilna, Jewish Vilna, is. And I was just there with a group of 13 students. And in a way, my students who are at the very beginning of their learning found Vilna more interesting than Warsaw. Warsaw was almost completely destroyed, flattened, right? There's really nothing there. But to me, one of the tricks of teaching students is that sometimes you go places to see what exists, right? You go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower. When you're doing work in the Yiddish world, oftentimes you're going to see what doesn't exist. And when you see what doesn't exist, you sometimes see a lot more than if it were still there. But in Warsaw, that was still early for them to be able to grasp that. Of course, there's a beautiful and compelling new museum. There's a totally redone Jewish Historical Institute exhibit of the Ringelblum archive. So there's a lot there. But in terms of the urban structure, the built landscape, where they could sort of imagine what the Jewish world looked like. They found that far more compelling in Vilna, who may not have many Jews left, but whose narrow streets are still there. But to me, who writes about Vilna and sort of lives in that world, I find that so much more plastic, so much more Disney-esque, to sort of walk those streets where now there are fancy boutiques, where formerly there would have been Jewish homes or Jewish shops. So there's an interesting way that we now, as scholars and as members of a community, have to sort of bridge that which is visible and that which was not. That is the concealed text and the revealed text, this is, in terms of literary scholarship, are both in conversation and oftentimes in tension with one another. And he writes in this same poem, let me see if I can just find that last paragraph. It's going to be hard for you to see. But he writes the following. He who thinks that his house is empty, so he's speaking to people now who have survived the war, not Jews, who've moved into Jewish spaces. He who thinks that his house is empty and walks in and puts up an idol, by this I think he means a cross, right? Cross on the wall. Makes his bed, puts on an abandoned shirt or a dress or a shawl. At night, he will hear the crying of children, and the shirt will become a grater, shredding his skin, until he runs madly out of the house as if his conscience had turned into a crow, and he will run, and his own shadow will not be able to catch up with him. So this is Sutzkever the poet. And the reason I spend time introducing Sutzkever the poet and embedding Sutzkever the poet in the broader literary history of the way Vilna is constructed is to get to the meat of the conversation that I want to have with you today about my efforts to translate for the first time into English his memoir of the Vilna Ghetto. So I have something prepared, and of course I'll leave some time for questions. So in the summer of 1944, in Moscow, this same Avrom Sutzkever publishes a book. Remember, this is in the Soviet Union. He publishes a book that becomes his only full-length non-fiction book in his entire career. He never publishes another non-fiction, full-length, memoiristic text that he calls Von Vilna Ghetto, from the Vilna Ghetto, 1941 to 1944. 24 years earlier, another noted writer of Vilna, Choral Synagogue, had published a work by the very same title after the First World War. And while Sutzkever certainly knew and would have been aware of Lunsky's anthology of Gestalten und Bilder, right, of sort of images and stories and pictures that were part of this self-conscious interwar movement to develop a myth of place that I talked about a few moments ago, Sutzkever's work, written in 1944-45, consisting of dozens of short episodes, were of a very different sort, detailing the cultural, spiritual, and material resilience and destruction of Vilna Jewry during its darkest hours. So what I'm trying to say is that the same title is used for both of these works, one published after World War I, one published after World War II. And if Choral Synagogue's Vilna Ghetto was designed to provide a modern, living, existing community with a bridge to its traditional past, Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto was a testimonial document designed to provide the city's refugees and the broader Yiddish-speaking world with a chronology of a catastrophic break in continuity, break with the past. The memoir was published by Emes, an official organ of the Communist Party in Moscow, and a year and a half later, around the same time, the edition appeared under a different imprint with the Association of Vilna Natives in France. While Sutzkever was at work on the memoir, his real literary energies were devoted to his volume of wartime poems that he was going to publish or would publish under the title Die Festung, the fortress, and initial drafts of what would later become his first epic poem, Geheimstadt, about a community of Jews hiding from the Nazis in the sewers of Vilna. Right? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that his main energies and desires as a poet are to write poetry. But suddenly he gets roped in to having to write a memoir. Scholars of Sutzkever have paid scant attention to this memoir. Despite his reputation as the most important Yiddish poet witness to Churban, and among the leading Yiddish literary figures of the post-war period of its restoration, it plays no significant role in discussion of the author's oeuvre. One might even go so far to say that Sutzkever himself erased his own memoir from public memory through its purposeful neglect. Everything he has to say, or later he said that everything he had to say about the Vilna Ghetto was contained and could be found in his poetry. And when he meticulously edited a volume in the 1960s of his collected works of the Churban, he did not reprint or ask for a reprint of his memoir of Old Vilna Ghetto. So we're faced with a real paradox or a real problem. On the one hand, one cannot doubt Sutzkever's deep investment and influence and responsibility in developing a dual body of both testimonial and aesthetic artistic literature that would serve as a permanent matzeva, a textual lieu de memoire to this community. He devoted a significant amount of his time in the Vilna Ghetto at great personal risk to both developing a mythopoetics of resistance and a mythopoetics of destruction, and, as we heard, to playing his part in the rescue of important artifacts from the city's libraries and archives. When he escaped from the Vilna Ghetto in September 1943 to join a partisan unit in the Narach forest, the literary imperative continued to claim him through his assignment as that partisan group's chronicler in the forests. However, how did he make it to Moscow? Well, when a poem of his was smuggled out of the Vilna Ghetto, a poem called Kol Nidre, about the self-sacrifice of a father towards his son during a Nazi roundup, he was, this made it somehow, well, we know how, but it made it all the way to the Soviet Union, all the way to Ilya Ehrenberg, who goes ahead and writes about it and writes about Sutzkever and published this in the Soviet Yiddish press. And it becomes one of the earliest examples of a poem, but also sort of a testimonial piece of work published in the Soviet Union about the destruction of European Jewry. And that's when, through a variety of contacts and through the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow, a plane is sent to rescue Sutzkever, to bring him to Moscow to serve sort of as an example of what is going on towards Soviet, now Soviet Jewry. However, Sutzkever had a problem because his Moscow period, which lasted from April 1944 through 1946, he traveled in between that back to Vilna, was productively feverish. He attempted to negotiate his new role in response to really problematic shifting landscapes, both as witness to the complete destruction of his home community and as a partisan poet who was now being upheld by his Soviet hosts as somehow the face of Jewish heroism by a Soviet regime which wanted to show or wanted to include the Jews as part of the broader struggle against German fascism. He also had to worry that his somewhat Yiddishist and certainly proto-Zionist sentiments be kept under wraps. He had a brother in Palestine. He had written in 1939 to the brother to ask whether he could get him an exit certificate. That is to say, there is no evidence that he was ever a communist. He did publish in the Vilna Yiddish press when the Soviets arrived. There was only one paper to publish in, and he sort of tested his hand to sort of make himself more appealing to his Soviet now the censors, but nothing would suggest that he was somehow inspanned or engagé and sympathetic to communism. So these years become a critical moment in his public transformation and self-fashioning from a private poet aesthete into a singular voice of a lost community. Only 2 days after he and his wife arrived in Moscow, he was asked to address a gathering of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, where he established himself as this chronicler of destruction, as a witness to Jewish heroism, and as an outlet for Jewish rage. When an excerpt of that speech appeared in the newspaper Einigkeit, also in April 1944, it anticipated the imperative to definitively resist a narrative that Jews were passive. Quote, "The whole world ought to know that in the woods of Lithuania and Belorussia, from which I have just come, hundreds of Jewish partisans are fighting, proud avengers of the spilt blood of their brothers," end quote. Later that month, when Ilya Ehrenberg published an article about his wartime experiences in Pravda called "The Triumph of a Human Being," Ehrenberg's portrait of Sutzkever established the link between art and the resistance that it inspired. There is no doubt that Sutzkever understood the expectations and limitations of writing in the Soviet Union. Not only was he at the forefront of resisting pressure from local communists in the 1930s, but he also believed strongly that the cultural distinctiveness, and I would even say the national dignity of the Jewish people, of the Jews as a people, was yoked to Jewish artistry, not to universalism. By contrast, his hosts, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, did not necessarily privilege Jewish nationality as a primary mode of Jewish identification, or at least not publicly. So we have here then an assumption that why is it that the only memoir written by Avrom Sutzkever does not figure prominently in his oeuvre, not only in the way scholars write about it, but in the way he related to it? How to explain its relative effacement? Well, when I approached several colleagues about my interest, now maybe, I don't know, at least a decade ago, it's about time that we translate this memoir of Avrom Sutzkever, one of the earlier memoirs of the destruction of a Jewish city, something written in Yiddish. There are things that you can say in Yiddish and Hebrew that we know that you can't necessarily say in non-Jewish languages. It would be worthwhile bringing that out. At first, I was greeted with unanticipated skepticism about the value of the project, and I would even say in some quarters with outright hostility. And two reactions figured prominently that I think are worthy of consideration. First, colleagues suggested that the memoir was politically compromised due to the fact that it was solicited, composed, and published in the Soviet Union. Was the memoir self-censored, they asked, to please his rescuers or ingratiate himself, or to protect his ability to function perhaps later as a writer in the USSR? And this is a serious question. To what extent could this memoir, Vilna Ghetto, be taken seriously as, quote, a reliable historical source when it was written under the watchful eyes of perhaps a censor by a writer who might have been eager to please? To what extent was its composition in some ways a fragile negotiation between the expectations of an immediate political need and perhaps his own desires to put everything he wanted to put into his poetry? In short, to what extent did the memoir serve competing imperatives: the need of history to write it all down, the desire of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to reshape the Jews' public image as loyal Soviets, and the need to the surviving remnants, that is, to the survivors of Vilna itself, to find a way to integrate their past into a present as a way to provide a path towards the future? That is, to what extent was the memoir an early example of the tensions between history, collective memory, and contemporary politics? And when I gave a talk on this, I was a fellow at Yad Vashem several years ago when I was on sabbatical, and I gave a talk about my desire to translate the memoir into English. It subsequently came out, a new edition came out in Hebrew, and I co-wrote the introduction to that Hebrew edition. But at the time, when I gave this talk at Yad Vashem, one of the strangest things happened to me in my entire career. I was sort of berated over and over by sort of on language grounds, basically people saying, what is it about you people who do Yiddish that you need your own hero? And you need your hero in Avrom Sutzkever. Clearly, the hero of the Vilna Ghetto was the Zionist Abba Kovner. We already have a poet, a partisan poet of the Vilna Ghetto. He was the leader of the military command. He came to Palestine and then to the land of Israel and to Israel after the war. He was one of the sort of visionaries of creating the Museum of the Diaspora. He was a way, that is, we already have a hero of the Vilna Ghetto, and he's reliable. What did Sutzkever do? He wrote poems. Yes, he was part of the Paper Brigade, but we know for the most part they let him alone and they let him sit in the attic so he could write his poems. And we know, yes, he was a partisan and he has a picture of himself with a gun that I showed you earlier, but of course he didn't know how to shoot the gun. And he wasn't really doing anything. He was just sitting there writing poems about shooting a gun, right? So what are you doing? And then they said, and of course there are all these examples that are unreliable about the memoir, right? He says, for instance, at one point that when he returned to Vilna, as upon liberation by the Soviets, that as part of that there were Jewish partisans marching in with the Soviets, and they were wearing their Soviet medals. And the people at Yad Vashem said, this shows that it's not reliable because the medals weren't given out until a certain amount of time after he says that it happened. So if that's not reliable, then how can anything be reliable? Or at one point, he writes about a particular nun who taught him how to use a grenade, who helped smuggle in a grenade, and then he was so sort of in the clouds that he didn't even know how to use the grenade, so he needed a nun to teach him how to use a grenade. But the nun that he names wasn't the nun that taught him, it was a different nun. So how can you translate any of this? So there was no sort of sense that perhaps the war was still going on when this project started, and it had only immediately ended when it was being published. That there was no time for distance. That is, it's not as though Sutzkever could go and check his memory and go to the archives and say, when exactly were medals given? Was it in July or was it in the middle of August? Or I can't remember. That is, there's no sense of the immediacy and the breathlessness of this text that was written. The second point that was often raised about not doing this was that Sutzkever really didn't want to, that he was compelled to, and that you should never translate something that might be less than what a writer thinks is his best. Now, to this I can only say, I think that literary history shows us that this is ridiculous, right? Kafka asked for all of his manuscripts to be burned. He might not, but they were published. Certainly we translate the letters and the diaries of writers, even though they aren't their masterpieces. That is, if we have a major writer in a national or linguistic tradition, normally if they're that important, we want to publish everything that they've written. And if it doesn't measure up to other things that they've written, then we can problematize that and question that. But just to say that because he considered poetry his favorite and most important genre, we shouldn't touch memoir, because in some way it'll provide us with a different image of Sutzkever, a lower image of Sutzkever. In a way, it'll create a more prosaic as opposed to a poetic image of Sutzkever. This didn't seem to me particularly compelling at all. Because what I was interested in coming to this memoir were the ways in which perhaps by reading the memoir, we would be able to find out more information about the poems that he wrote. And in that, I can say I was frustrated. That is, I thought that of all his famous poems, whether it be Avogen Shich, right, about seeing his murdered mother's shoe in a wagon, Avogen Shich, or Zum Kind, about the murder of his infant child, when his child is born, or Die Lehrerin Mira, the teacher Mira, that somehow these most famous of Sutzkever's poems that are published, in the memoir, I would find a prose description of exactly what happened, be able to find out more information and be able to say, see, here are the examples upon which he draws. And what I realized early on was that that was going to be denied. And I've come to appreciate why that's denied. That is, for Sutzkever, the most important thing in communicating experience was the poetic experience itself. And in some ways, the prose experience, especially when dealing with things that were already written about or would be written about in poetry, were completely unnecessary to actually write about, because you could say so much more and experience so much more and mythologize so much more in poetry than you ever could in prose. So here we come up with sort of if that's not what the memoir does, then are the critics correct? Are the accusations of the critics correct? So what do they say? They say they dismissed it because it was spare or perhaps at times erroneous in its historical knowledge. It provided a potentially compromised political and self-serving moment. It would diminish the author's poetic reputation by perhaps producing something that wasn't up to something that he wanted to have reproduced. And of course, they said Sutzkever himself never promoted the work later in his career, suggesting that the writer had disassociated himself from it. Now, that's when scholars continue, right? When faced with these type of questions, you include them in introduction, you acknowledge them, you work through them, you think of them, but you don't simply abandon the work. So what is this work that I hope at some point, maybe in a year and a half or 2 years, I can come back and talk to you about once again once it's out? Well, Von Vilna Ghetto is a memoir in 4 parts, covering a period of exactly 3 years. It moves chronologically opening with the German attack on the Soviet-controlled Vilnius as part of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and ending with the author's return to the city from Moscow immediately after its liberation in July 1944. Its first and its last section, first and fourth sections, cover the periods of the initial Nazi occupation, and then the last section is a testimonial chapter, which gathers testimony from eyewitnesses. And I think this is really important to mention, that in some ways, Sutzkever's personality and reputation are so strong by the time this memoir comes out, based on his pre-war reputation as well, that he goes to great efforts to include a memoir that is polyvocal. That is, by that last chapter, it's all quotations. I heard this by so-and-so, a story told to me by so-and-so. In a way, it's an individual memoir that functions as collective history and collective testimony and collective witnessing. And that chapter alone, that last section, is unbelievable. The opening and closing chapters really are all subdivided into smaller episodes, and they bookend two longer middle sections. One called Behind the Gate, which concentrates on the internal organization and social and political and especially cultural life of the Vilna Ghetto, that which we heard about, the schools, the teachers, the songs, the organizing. And the third chapter, the United Partisan Organization, which focuses on physical resistance in the ghetto. And just this week, I mean, I've been reading about how all of these hidden hideouts and hidden cellars, where not only people but manuscripts and books were hidden, were physically dug by engineers. It's an amazing, amazing history that he's able to provide us with here. So in terms of space, I want to suggest that the memoir privileges in these two middle sections, these two thick sections, expressions of what we might call organizational, cultural, and physical resistance, in an attempt to craft a heroic narrative of ghetto life as a balance, as a counterbalance against the last chapter, which is really a chronicle of its destruction. And since these models of communal endurance are bracketed by murder and humiliation and annihilation, the memoir is haunted by this unreconcilable tension, namely that the spiritual and physical resistance in which Sutzkever himself was so deeply invested had proved unable to save most of Vilna Jewry, including his infant child and mother. In one of the memoir's penultimate scenes, this tension is actually realized, as Sutzkever and his partisan comrades dig up the treasures that we heard about earlier, that they had buried earlier in a ghetto hiding spot. Quote, "We came to one of the most important malinas, the most important hiding places. We found posters of Goldfaden's first theater performance, a box of letters by Sholem Aleichem, manuscripts by Bialik and Gorky and Mendele and Yehoyash. And in a corner we found sculptures, most of them rescued by the Ansky Museum. In the obscurity we saw a bust of the head of Tolstoy by sculptor Ilya Ginsberg. And while digging out Antokolsky's sculpture of David, we suddenly saw an arm, but my body froze. It was not plaster. It was one of the Jews hiding in the city's Melina who had been buried and died next to the sculpture." So this yoking together of the spiritual and the physical, the relief that their dangerous work had managed to preserve some of the spiritual and cultural treasures of the city, at the same time with this sort of grotesque reminder for the reader at what cost all of that came, resisted mythologizing in prose. Personal and cultural survival was rendered minuscule in comparison to the fate of ordinary Jews. Next, the memoir, interestingly enough, this was fascinating to me, did not offer any overview of pre-war Vilna and its importance in Jewish life. That is, the very first lecture that we heard today provides us sort of with this sense of why Vilna is important. But when Sutzkever publishes this, there's no need for Yiddish readers to explain why Vilna is important. So it immediately starts with the bombing of Vilna in 1941. And he never has to go back and say, this is why this is important, this is why this matters, this is why it has meaning. All of that he can write, all that is sort of implied in shorthand, because who else would understand that other than a Yiddish reader? He was hypersensitive in that sense about finding the proper balance between the personal and collective experience, between his own fate and the fate of the majority of his community. And it may also be that he self-censored himself regarding his reception in the Soviet Union, or even thanking his Soviet sponsors in this memoir for his rescue because of his fears of political co-option. Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto then should be appreciated as a very early attempt, I think, not only at written Holocaust history, but at the gathering of oral Holocaust history. Because so much of it includes the testimonials of others, my colleague Chana Polin Galai, now at Tel Aviv University, has written about how Sutzkever's prose and letter writing function as a type of testimonial exchange, in which, because of his prestige and reputation as a writer, as a poet, as a partisan, people write to him, people tell him things, under the assumption not only that he becomes their relief for their stories, but then he then, as the writer, can find the medium to translate those for a broader reading public. But we know that the goals of memoir and the goals of testimony are not synonymous, right? The goals of memoir are meant to reflect on experience, whereas the goals of testimony, in the most legalistic sense of the term, are designed to serve the cause of justice. And Sutzkever's memoir, in that sense, seems much more a testimonial document than a memoiristic text. That is, it seems less interested in exposing the self than in telling the stories of others, and in telling the stories of others to become an evidentiary document for perhaps use later, either in war crimes or in other ways of setting the record straight about the Nazis. For instance, the first extended testimony to appear early in the memoir, when the name Ponar is first mentioned, suggests that it is a place, quote, that the Germans would create a map where Ponar would not exist. Right? He's saying he already understands that if the Germans win, or if the German narratives win, not only will Ponar, or the memory of Ponar, be written out of history, but it might even be written out of space. That is because we know that when you think of a map, we always think that maps are representational, right? Maps are also texts. Maps are also human constructions. They're also narratives. And you can leave off a map as much as you can put onto a map. So he already has this worry that Ponar, this space of mass execution, could be written out of geographic space and hence out of Jewish memory and global memory writ large. So by acknowledging, remember, this is still very, very early, 1944, 1945. By acknowledging the German desire to wipe out evidence of their crimes, he goes on to provide the evidence and testimony of one Motel Gdud, born in 1922 in Vilna. He publishes this in the memoir. And this is what Motel tells him, quote, "I saw people shot in front of me. We had to get undressed in front of a pit. Scheinberg took a hysteric to the edge of the pit and beat him with the tip of his revolver. I wished I would die quickly. Bodies fell on top of me. The agony of pain. I lost consciousness in a pit of death." As an evidentiary document, then, the memoir sees itself as responsible not only for narrating Nazi crimes, but also for naming specific perpetrators. The memoir cites 11 perpetrators by name, in contrast to his poetry, which does not mention a single one ever. That is, the realm of poetry was the realm of spiritual purity. That was the not that it didn't write about difficult things, but that was the Jewish space. The realm of memoir was the place for pointing fingers. I think I'll end with one point that we heard about earlier, and then I can take your questions. The memoir conflates both physical and cultural expression in the ghetto into a single resistance struggle. I think this is important to remember because it's still a source of controversy in some days. Even in the Vilna Ghetto itself, when there was a desire to establish a ghetto theater, there were people who were opposed to the ghetto theater because they accused those who were putting it on of saying that you don't perform theater in a graveyard. So there's still this historiographic controversy about whether the thickness of cultural life in places like the Vilna Ghetto normalized and perhaps distracted the population, or perhaps provided them, on the other hand, with a sense of themselves and their own humanity. right? And Sutzkever has to take that on, right, to the extent that he recognizes that he escapes from his community in the end, and most of Vilna Jewry does not survive. The later historical question that people are going to ask is going to be, well, you had a school, you had a theater, you had music groups, you have art. What good did any of that do? Could those resources or energies have been put into a different place? This is one philosophical question that the memoir sort of at least considers by exposing the importance of all of those things to the community. At the same time, in talking about the physical resistance, that is the partisan organization, the memoir does not judge. It doesn't judge certain decisions. It certainly doesn't judge the most difficult decision of the ghetto period, namely whether the commander of the United Partisan Organization, Itzik Wittenberg, who eventually went underground, should give himself up because people were demanding, the Nazis were demanding that he give himself up and were threatening the community with even larger destruction if he didn't. He ended up dying, but he doesn't weigh in on that, nor does he weigh in on larger questions about sort of strategy. You're not going to get that from the memoir. But I think that the importance of it is to place it also in a genealogy of Yiddish memoir. That is so much of what we know about World War II nowadays, or so much what we know in North America about World War II, comes to us from novels and poems, and especially from memoiristic texts that are written in non-Jewish languages. And those of us who work with Yiddish texts understand that what you can say in Yiddish and Hebrew about the events of this time are different than what polite company will allow for export in non-Jewish languages. So there's a tremendous deal, and I think it's healthy, necessary, important to confront it, of rage expressed here, humiliation, not humiliation about what they did, but just showing the degree of depravity that perhaps we don't necessarily see in other memoirs, and certainly don't have as immediate in the sense of having something that's written without any sense of historical perspective. So I think with that, I will end and open up any of your questions, and that'll allow me to save a few more comments that I have for another time. Thank you. Do we want to just have questions, or are there any questions? Yes.
It's not about Sutzkever himself, but when he was talking about Younger Vilna,
Yes.
and you're mentioning their anti-romantic feeling,
Yes.
how much communication they had with other writers that period, the lost generation in America, and what was going on in Europe?
Well, they certainly knew. They certainly knew what was going on, broadly speaking, in literary terms. But they were reading Russian writers. They were reading German modernist writers. They certainly knew what was going on in Polish literature at the time, but they didn't necessarily have direct relationships with most Polish writers for political and nationalist and nativist reasons at the time. But they were very well read. And their desire to really prove themselves the latest generation among a long line of Yiddish modernist groups in the interwar period was quite self-conscious. And in that sense, they didn't reject the inheritance of Vilna as much as other groups elsewhere had rejected literary history that came before them. One of the things that we might want to look at just briefly that I didn't mention is the way this text creates a photographic testimony very early on. Remember that we're having something published right after the war in the Soviet Union. And I could provide you with a sort of an hour lecture on the narrative, the implied narrative that exists through the photos that he includes, right? So the first photo is of Sutzkever holding a gun. But the last photo is a sculpture that was saved by, of King David. I don't think this is an accident. That is, you have the great poet of the ancient period who was also a fighter, right? And you have the great poet of his own period who's also a fighter, as both the first and the last image. Photos that provide evidence of what happened, whether it be the physical nature of the ghetto, or whether it be documents from the ghetto. Different types of officials. Sutzkever's own Polish rescuer. I'll try to fix this here. Evidence of bodies. evidence of women as part of the partisan organization. A cache of things that were hidden, among them that were mentioned in the book. Evidence of war crimes, evidence of who perpetrated the war crimes, evidence of the young artist sitting on Sutzkever's lap who becomes one of the youngest artists of the Vilna Ghetto, a portrait of Itzik Wittenberg, the commander of the Vilna Ghetto, the remains of the Vilna Ghetto, the remains of the Vilna Gaon and the center to the Schulhof, other members of the underground, fighting, Abba Kovner, images here of statues and of posters, bodies being burned, a bunker in the forests, discovering evidence of war crimes, and Statue of David. All of these are included in the memoir. And remember, now we have an entire visual history of the Holocaust, not only through film, but through famous images of the young boy with his hands up in the Vilna Ghetto. That's now we're very used to that. But imagine these images coming out in a text while the war, in the immediate aftermath of the war, when no one had that visual imagery yet. To me, that's daring. To me, that's something that's new. And to me, despite any critiques or criticisms of any text, that is something that needs to be looked at as a text that's not only testimonial and accusatory, but it's also building upon a genre that we've sort of lost nowadays. And that is the genre of the reportage. That is, this is a text that really borrows from a European and especially an Eastern European genre in terms of its mode of writing and in terms of its affect, right? Trying not to be emotional, trying to describe things, trying to give different voices their particularity and also their time and space. All of these things can be then included into a way of thinking about this memoir in its own time and in its own moment. I think we've reached 4:15.
I'd like to thank you, Professor Cammy,
Thank you.
for complicating matters yet again. Fascinating, and I look forward to your book.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming.